Chapter 25. Jack and Palmer stepped off the road to walk in the ditch at its side. The traffic coming the other way was heavy, with a large number of wounded troops making their way to the rear. They had left Ballard and the others behind, heading east across country in search of the men of McMahon's 2nd Division. Twice they had been forced to go to ground as large bodies of Austrian Uhlans and skirmishers probed the gap between the French general's 2 divisions. Their nerves had been stretched thin as they hid away, but eventually they had found their way onto a road heading south that they hoped would lead them to the village of Marcello. Jack looked over the men coming back the other way along the road. The French infantrymen had clearly been in a hard fight. Their dark blue uniforms were streaked with dust, and several had lost the light kepis from their heads. Many wore light blue neckscarves, a new addition to their uniform that most of the French army had picked up in Genoa, and a number of these had been pressed into action as temporary bandages. Most of the wounded walked past with their heads bowed and their eyes averted. But a few looked at the 2 men in civilian clothes going the wrong way. One, an officer sporting a blue sash around his waist and an open waistcoat that revealed a white shirt streaked with blood, paused long enough to call across to them, "Monsieur, vous allez dans le mauvais sens." What's that? Jack had no idea what he was being told. "He says we're going the wrong way," Palmer replied. He ignored the French officer. "You understand frog?" Palmer shrugged. "Vous devriez faire demi-tour," the officer called over his shoulder. "Si vous tenez à votre vie." "What does he say?" Jack asked as the last of the battalion passed them by. "He says it's fine. Nothing to worry about." "Bullshit." Palmer shrugged. "It doesn't matter what he says. We have our orders." Jack did not bother to reply. He followed Palmer, heading towards the battle that they could hear raging ahead. They kept to the ditch, leaving the road to the wounded French soldiers. "Poor buggers," Jack observed. "They're well out of it." Palmer glanced down at the revolver on Jack's hip. "You loaded?" Jack nodded. He had prepared the firearm while he was waiting for Palmer and Ballard to return. He let his hand fall to his holster and unbuckled the flap. He could see a village directly ahead. It was wreathed in powder smoke, and the only French troops in evidence were those coming towards them, away from the fighting. "You think that's Marcello?" he asked. "Why? We better get a move on. Looks to me like the Frenchies aren't going to stand there for long." "We could wait here. Ask after our man as they come back." Palmer laughed off the notion. "Come on, Jack. You frightened?" "Of course." Jack's right hand took hold of the hilt of his sabre. "But that's because I'm not bottlehead stupid, not like some." Palmer ignored the reply and moved off at a trot. Jack went with him. They moved quickly. The traffic on the road had reduced to a trickle, only a handful of Frenchmen now making their way away from the fighting. Both the road and the ditch were littered with discarded equipment, and Jack's boots kicked a discarded kepi as he scrambled back up onto the road as it entered the outskirts of the village. The houses in front of them bore the scars of the fighting. Walls were cracked and pockmarked, the ground around them piled with rubble. The air was full of dust and powder smoke, the smell catching in Jack's throat. The sound of rifle fire echoed down the street. Somewhere ahead, a French unit was heavily engaged with the enemy. Jack saw 2 French officers run into a house just to their right. He guessed the building had been turned into a command post, and that made it a wise choice of destination. "Quick, in there!" He led Palmer across the road and into the house. It was noisy inside. Raised voices shouted and bellowed as half a dozen officers tried to make sense of the fight. A scarred kitchen table had been dragged to the centre of the room and pressed into service. A single map was on its top, and the two officers Jack had followed inside were busy pointing at various spots as they made a report to an older officer standing on the far side of the table. Jack could understand nothing. The French officers were talking loudly and quickly. One of them turned to push past as he made his way back out. If he was surprised to see two civilians, he did not wait around long enough to show it. "Ask them where we can find the Legion," Jack shouted the instruction into Palmer's ear. Palmer nodded in agreement, then pressed forward, using his elbows freely to force his passage. Jack had seen enough, so made his way back outside. Palmer was not long in joining him. "They're not here." "Then where the hell are they?" Jack was not impressed. "No one knows. These fellows are from the same division, but they've got no idea where the Legion's got to." "Shit." Jack spat out the single word. Before Palmer could say anything further, a great roar rose from just ahead, and a wave of French infantrymen came running towards them, their ranks in disarray. Some stopped to turn and discharge their rifles, but most just kept going. More soldiers followed them, at least 100 now, every man's eyes bright white in his powder-streaked face. The French officers came running out of their command post. Orders were shouted as they ran towards their men. Already some were stopping, the retreat losing its impetus as the officers started to regain command of the frightened infantrymen. "Come on!" Palmer grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him away. "We should help." Jack shook off the grip. "And do what?" Palmer snapped. "They will hold or they won't. We won't make any difference." Jack ignored him and strode into the melee. The French officers were trying to form their men up into a line. Most were slow to obey, their expressions revealing their fear. Jack snatched his revolver from its holster and forced himself into the press of bodies. "Form line!" he shouted, not caring if he was understood or not. "Form line, damn your eyes!" He hauled a man around, forcing him into place at his side. Around him, the French officers were doing the same, and slowly a formed line began to emerge from out of the chaos. Other soldiers saw what was being done and joined in, filling out the line so that it stretched from one side of the road to the other. "Face front!" Jack could not help bellowing the order. He stood in the centre of the front rank. The pants and gasps of the breathless French infantrymen around him were subsiding, their fear now held in check as their officers brought them back under control. "Il arrive!" Voices cried out in warning, the sound just about audible over the shouts of the officers. Jack saw the flood of white uniformed soldiers come charging into view. There was no time to dwell on his first sight of the Austrian army, and he raised his revolver, filling the space over the end of the barrel with the face of an enemy soldier. "Feu! Fire!" Jack bellowed at the men around him as he pulled the trigger. Those French soldiers with a loaded weapon opened fire. This was no organised volley, yet it still cut down the leading ranks of Austrian troops. Jack fired again and then again, emptying the revolver's chambers without pause. Around him, French infantrymen were reloading as fast as they could, their hands moving with desperate haste. The command to fire came for a second time. This time more men were ready and the volley had more effect. Dozens of bullets flayed the advancing Austrian ranks, knocking over those leading the charge. It would be enough. The Austrian infantry had pushed the French back from the far side of the village, but the impetus of their attack was spent. It was their turn to retreat, the loud shouts of the officers calling the battered ranks away. The French had held, and now their officers shouted orders of their own as they prepared to advance once again. Jack pushed his way out of the line and returned to find Palmer sitting calmly on a low wall to the front of the command post. He was paying the fighting no heed, and was using a lock pin to clean under his nails. From somewhere, he had secured a French rifle, and he had slung an ammunition pouch over his shoulder and attached a cap box to his belt. A bayonet tipped the rifle, a thin smear of blood on the blade showing that it had already seen use that day. "Are you done now?" The question was delivered with a fair dollop of sarcasm. "Shut your mouth." Jack did not appreciate Palmer's tone. He strode past, not caring if the man followed him or not. Chapter 26. So, where to next? Jack posed the question as they picked their way through the debris spread across the road. The sun was low in the sky to the west as the two Englishmen left the village behind. Palmer had slung his borrowed rifle over his shoulder and now walked with his thumb poked comfortably under its sling. "You're the one with those fancy field glasses. Why don't you take a look-see?" "That's it. That's all you can suggest." "What else do you want?" "It would be nice if you could be bothered to help." "Like you did back there?" "What do you mean by that?" Jack was struggling to hold his temper in check. He had seen what was needed and had done his best to make it happen. "It weren't our fight." Palmer's voice was unchanged. "We were there." "So? We could have walked away, got on with our mission. Instead, you wanted to play the hero." "I did not." Jack's anger was simmering now. "I did what had to be done." "Why? Do you think those Frenchies couldn't manage without you being there to hold their hand?" "Those men were running. They had to be stopped." "Aye, that's right enough. But why by you?" "Because I was there." Palmer shook his head at such folly. "You still love it." "Love what?" Jack spat out the reply. "Battle." "You think so? You think I want to fight?" "No. I know you do." "You're mad." Jack felt his anger wane. He had denied Palmer's accusation, but in truth he knew the older man was correct. He would not admit it aloud, for to do so would be to reveal the rotten core to his soul, and that he would not do, not to anyone. Instead, he sat down at the road's edge and began the laborious task of reloading his revolver. "I've seen men like you before." Palmer broke the silence. "They survive a battle or two, so they start to believe that they're good at fighting, that they have a talent for it." He watched Jack pull out the small pot of grease that he used to seal each freshly loaded chamber on his revolver. "Truth is, they were just lucky. One day that luck runs out, and they're just as dead as the poor bastard who died in the first minutes of his first battle." Jack stopped what he was doing and met Palmer's flat stare. "And you're different, I suppose?" Palmer shrugged. "I do what has to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. I know that one day my luck will run out. I don't see the point in trying to make that day come along any quicker than it needs to." Jack's anger had disappeared. He could not argue against the truth. He returned his attention to his revolver. Only when he had finished loading it did he look at Palmer again. "What about that lucky man? What if his luck holds? What if he goes on surviving?" "Then I pity the poor bastard." The way he said the words made Jack laugh. "You know what I think? I don't care what you think. I think," Jack continued anyway, "that we need to find this man Ballard wants. So, take those field glasses of yours and see what you can see." Jack nodded. "You better stay there. I don't want you getting too tired. Your old bones can't take it." He got to his feet and thrust his handgun back into its holster before fishing out the glasses. He left Palmer behind and clambered onto a low rise on the western side of the road. Only when he reached the top did he put the glasses to his face. At first there was little to see. To the west was McMahon's reserve division and the black flag of the first aid post where he had left Ballard. He panned south. The ground there was covered by a great expanse of woodland that went on for what looked to be a good half-mile before it pressed against a ridge of higher ground. On top of the ridge was an area that was more built up, the houses larger and grander than the other villages he had seen. A tall church tower stood proud from the other buildings, dominating the surroundings. Here at last he spotted movement. He could not help a sharp intake of breath as he made out the Austrian infantrymen occupying the buildings around the foot of the tower, their bright white uniforms making them stand out against the dull stone at their backs. They were plainly expecting a French advance. Prepared defences lined the outer reaches of the village, with wooden palisades blocking the main approach. Jack panned back towards the woods. This time, he saw French soldiers, and they were fighting. As far as he could tell, what looked to be an entire French brigade was advancing along a road that cut straight through the dense woodland. They were heavily engaged with Austrian troops. Much of the fighting was happening in the woods to either side of the road, and he could see little more than rolling clouds of powder smoke and occasional flashes of musket fire. He took a deep breath. He guessed the French were over a mile away. It was a fair distance, but he could just about make out their uniforms. He lowered the glasses. Palmer was looking at him, waiting patiently for news. "There are French troops about a mile to the southwest," Jack called across to his companion with a smile on his face. "I think I just found the Legion." The French brigade had reformed into two marching columns by the time Palmer and Jack reached them. There was no sign of the Austrians, other than the bodies strewn across the road and in the woodland to either side. The fight had been short and sharp, the French beating back the Austrian attack with rifle volleys and bayonets. The French officers appeared to be in no hurry to resume their advance. They fussed over the ranks as they prepared their men for the assault on the Austrian-held town on the high ground away to the far side of the woodland that Jack had seen through his field glasses. As the two British agents ran up, a French general and his staff were parading past. The infantry cheered as they spotted their commander, whilst Jack and Palmer were forced to one side by the gaggle of officers following dutifully behind their general. Jack took the opportunity to look at the men who would assault the heavily defended town. Those to his front wore the fabulous Turkish-style uniform of the Zouave. He had seen men like these in the Crimea. They were immediately identifiable in their baggy off-white linen trousers and short dark blue jackets edged in red. On their heads they wore red chechias with a dark blue tassel. They were a splendid-looking regiment. But there was more to the Zouave than a fancy uniform. The dour-faced men in the ranks had earned a reputation as hard fighters, the regiment's long experience in North Africa giving them plenty of opportunities to learn their trade. Now they showed the scars of the recent fighting. A fair number bore wounds, bound up with neckerchiefs or temporary dressings made from undershirts. Their clothing was stained with blood, their faces streaked with powder marks, and they bore the determined stares of men who had fought hard, but you knew the battle was not yet done. "So, have you found the Legion?" Palmer stood red-faced at Jack's side. They had run for over a mile and both were hot and sweaty. "No." Jack had no breath for more. The French general was heading to the front of the Zouave, so Jack followed the 20 or so mounted staff officers who trailed in his wake. The two men were forced to run again to keep up, but they got close enough to hear the general shout out in triumph as he rounded the front of the regiment. "Voici la Légion! L'affaire est dans le sac!" Jack pushed through the horses so that he could see just what the French general had spotted. It was only as he stepped past the last officer that he saw the regiment at the front of the second column. He drew in a sharp intake of breath. The men were wearing long blue tunics with green epaulets over baggy white trousers paired with white garters. The French general had seen them first, and it had been his words that had given Jack hope that their search had come to an end. They had found the Legion. The French marched with a great fanfare. They had reformed from the column of march into 2 groups of 4 battalions arranged in mixed order. In each formation, 2 battalions formed into line, whilst the other 2 moved into battalion column, 1 on each flank. The 2 battalions in line provided enough firepower to overwhelm the enemy, whilst those on the flanks gave the column depth and strength. Each regiment's colours led the way, the bright tricolours lifted high so that every man in the ranks could see them. Deep in the formations, drummers beat out the staccato rhythm of the march. The young boys charged with taking the instruments into battle, driving the great columns forward. Jack and Palmer stood and watched as the regiment they had sought for hours went on the attack against the town to the south of their current position. From what Jack had seen, the Austrians were there in good numbers. They had been given enough time to prepare a series of fixed defences, and the garden walls and squat stone buildings would offer them a dozen strongpoints from which to fight off the French attack. It was a solid defensive position, and the French would have to fight hard to force the Austrian infantry to retreat. It took several long minutes for the 2 assault formations to pass them by. As the last ranks marched past, Jack and Palmer forced their tired bodies into motion. The Legion was marching in battalion column on the right flank of the advance, and so the 2 Englishmen took up a position behind its rearmost company. No one told them to go away or asked them why they were there. Jack quickly gave up trying to see if the man they sought was in the ranks ahead of him. All they could do was tag along and hope to find their target in the chaos of the assault. It was not much of a plan, but it was the best they had. Chapter 27. The French marched to the hypnotic rhythm of the drums. It was the pas de charge, the same nerve-rending beat that had driven the great French columns against the enemies of the first Napoleon. Jack walked at the rear of the formation, yet he still felt the mesmerising power of the drumbeat. He wondered at the bravery of Wellington's men in red coats who had stood in their 2-man deep line waiting for the ponderous columns to come against them. The French must have seemed unstoppable, the massed ranks certain to swamp the thin red line that stood in its path. Yet the British had held their ground, the power of their battalion volleys bludgeoning the great columns to a halt. Now the French army had come back to a European battlefield. Jack did not know if McMahon had finally located his 2nd Division, or if its commander was acting independently. Either way, one of them had ordered an entire brigade to assault the Austrian-held town ahead. It was a test of their bravery as much as of their musketry, and not one French soldier doubted that the Austrians would fail to stand against them. Whoever was in command had ordered every gun they could find to take up a position to support the attack. The batteries had been massed together on a railway embankment, the raised ground giving them a good line of fire. Jack counted 39 guns, all aimed at the barricaded streets and wooden palisades behind which the Austrian infantry waited, ready to turn back the massive formations coming towards them. As one, the cannon opened fire. The heavy shells seared towards the Austrian defences. They landed in one dreadful apocalyptic storm, ploughing up roads, smashing walls and ripping through the houses in which hundreds of Austrian reserves sheltered. More shells landed within moments, everyone pounding into the defences. The wooden palisades were torn apart, and red-hot shards of shrapnel ricocheted in every direction. The heavy shells wrought a dreadful destruction on the densely packed ranks. Limbs were torn from bodies, flesh ripped apart as the French artillery threw the defences into chaos. The infantry cheered as their gunners pounded the town. The new rifled cannon were unerringly accurate, and the cheers doubled in intensity as the gunners began to fire at will, great gouts of flames leaping from the barrels. Jack could not help but flinch as another massive volley ripped through the sky. He knew what it was to endure such a barrage. The Russian gunners holding the great redoubt on the banks of the Alma River had created similar carnage in the British ranks marching towards them. He could not bring himself to cheer as the shells ground the Austrian defences into so much dust. He had heard something of the Lahit system the French used to convert the smoothbore cannon they had at their disposal. The rifling inside the barrel doubled the cannon's range, vastly increasing their accuracy. The system did for cannon what the new rifling and Minié bullets had done for the infantry's rifles. Now the Austrians were on the receiving end of an artillery barrage the like of which had never been seen on any battlefield, and it was decisive. Under such devastating fire, no infantry could hope to survive, and the Austrians manning the palisades and barricades broke. They jammed the streets in their haste to escape, unwittingly making the French gunners' job all the easier. The artillery poured on the fire without mercy, their new conical shells gouging great holes in the enemy's broken ranks. The streets were littered with the dead and the dying, the living trampling both into the dirt as they tried to get away. The French infantry pressed on, covering the sloping ground quickly. Their gunners fired without pause, the roar of the concentrated artillery fire loud enough to drown out the beat of the drum, so that the columns appeared to advance in silence. They reached the outskirts without taking a single casualty. Still the French gunners continued, the flatter trajectory of the new rifled cannon allowing them to fire over the heads of the advancing infantry. Even from his place in the rear of the Legion's column, Jack could hear the dreadful sound of the exploding shells, the meaty slap of shrapnel hitting piles of bodies, and the higher-pitched crack as it ricocheted off trees and buildings. With a great cheer, the French charged. The ground was littered with bodies and broken weapons. The Frenchmen pounded over it all, their callous boots crushing any wounded man left lying in their path. Jack went with them, driving into the rearmost ranks as the men stormed into the narrow streets. He ploughed ahead, feeling nothing as his boots thumped into a headless corpse left lying on the ground. He had no idea where Palmer was, but he did not care. He freed his weapons as he ran, pulling his sabre from its scabbard and hefting his revolver into his left hand. He was not there to fight, but he would not be unprepared. The Legion's column was breaking up fast. Men ran in every direction as they hurtled into the narrow streets that led into the heart of the town. Already rifles were cracking out, the first shots being fired as the French troops started to find Austrian soldiers hiding in the closest houses. Jack went with one group. He tried to look at their faces, but they were going too fast and he had no choice but to go with them. The artillery barrage stopped. The French gunners could no longer fire without risking hitting their own men, and so the infantry were left to clear the town with nothing more than their rifles and bayonets. More rifle and musket fire crashed out from the street that Jack was running down. He saw men fall just ahead, a handful of Legionnaires paying the price for being brave enough to lead the attack. "Come on!" he roared encouragement as the men around him charged on. They burst around a corner and saw half a dozen white-coated Austrian soldiers formed into a makeshift line. The Austrians had fired the volley that had killed the Legionnaire's comrades, and now they were frantically reloading. They would not get the chance. The men with Jack cheered, then stormed forward. They hit the Austrian line hard, their bayonets thrusting forward as soon as they were close enough to attack. The Frenchmen fought with vicious intensity. Not one Austrian landed a blow before they were all cut down dead. Almost immediately the Legionnaires came under fire. Muskets were thrust out of upper-floor windows and fired down into the street. A man in front of Jack spun around, his hands clasped to his ruined face. Another cursed as a musket ball gouged a crevice in his upper arm, the blood spurting from between his clutching fingers. "Off the street!" Jack shouted the order. He grabbed the wounded man and threw him to one side. "Follow me!" He did not know if the Legionnaires understood him or not. He ran towards one of the houses he had spotted musket fire coming from. He saw a door, so he ran at it, kicking it open with his boot the moment he was in rage. The door crashed back on its hinges. He caught a glimpse of a terrified Austrian soldier before a musket was fired almost directly into his own face. He screamed then, the cry torn from him in a moment of pure terror. The ball spat so close that he felt the wind of its passing on his neck. There was no time to dwell on the near miss. The Austrian soldier shouted in defiance, then thrust his bayonet at the man he had so nearly shot down. Jack battered it away. He heard the Austrian's howl of frustration turn into a shout of horror as he shoved the barrel of his revolver into the man's face. He didn't stop to think. He did not care that it was not his fight, that he had no place being in the thick of the action. He saw only a man trying to kill him. He pulled the trigger. The tip of the barrel was so close to the man's face that the jet of flame spat out as it fired and licked against his skin before the bullet half tore his head from his shoulders. He fell away, his scream cut off. Jack was pushed forward by men desperate to escape from the musket balls being fired down into the street. His boots caught on the body of the man he had killed. He stumbled and only caught his balance as he was propelled onto a flight of stairs that led to an upper story. He cried out, fear surging through him as he imagined his own death. The Austrians upstairs had to know what was coming. His boots pounded on the wooden treads. With every pace he expected to see a musket barrel being aimed towards him. This time, he knew they would not miss. And he bellowed as he went, his sword flailing out in front of him in a futile attempt to keep himself safe. He lost his footing as he went over the last stair and fell forward, pain flashing through him as his knees hit the wooden floor. He was still scrabbling on the ground when the volley reached him. The Austrians on the upper floor had held their fire for this moment. They waited for the first few Frenchmen to arrive, and then they fired. At such close range their muskets were dreadfully effective. The two Legionnaires driving Jack ahead of them died in an instant, their flesh torn by the multiple impacts. Jack felt the touch of spilt blood on his skin, but it was not his, and his delight at still being alive drove him into the fight. He saw nothing but a target for his sword, and he got to his feet, then drove his weapon into an Austrian's gut. The man clutched at the blade buried in his flesh. Jack withdrew it sharply, slicing through the grasping fingers, half severing them. The man staggered away, and Jack backhanded the sword, slicing at a white-coated Austrian driving a bayonet at his side. The sword went wide, but it forced the Austrian to twist away sharply enough to save Jack from his attack. In the cramped confines of the upper room, there was little opportunity for finesse. He drove forward, throwing himself against the nearest Austrian, hitting the man with his shoulder, the contact jarring through him. The man staggered backwards, giving Jack enough space to level his revolver. The handgun pressed against a man's side, and he pulled the trigger instantly. The sound barely registered over the roars of men fighting for their lives, but he heard his target scream as the heavy bullet tore through his flesh. More Frenchmen came up the stairs. This time there was no volley to greet them, and they threw themselves into the melee. The fighting was vicious. Jack saw one Legionnaire tumble back down the stairs, a bayonet striking him through an eye socket. An Austrian died as a Frenchman disemboweled him, his guts blue and pulsating as they spilt into his hands. One of the Austrians swung his rifle butt at Jack's head. He saw the blow coming, so ducked underneath it. A heartbeat later, the man thrust his bayonet at him, the bloodied steel whispering past his face. He stayed low, then rose quickly, driving his sword into the Austrian's groin. It was a cruel blow, and the steel went deep before he twisted his wrist, gouging away the man's life as he prevented the sword getting stuck fast in the suction of the dying man's flesh. He cried out as the man fell against him. He feared for his life, his backside puckering as he waited for the cold touch of a knife. But the Austrian was already dying, and he slid down Jack's front, sinking first to his knees, then onto the floor. The Frenchman cheered as the last Austrian fell. Jack bent double and sucked in a huge lungful of air, only to gag on it. The rotten egg stink of spent powder mixed with the smell of blood and shit to create the evil miasma of battle. Even as he choked down another breath, the fight replayed in his mind. The closeness of his own death appalled him. He thought about what Palmer had said. He had believed that he had a talent for battle, his skill at killing the one honest thing about him. He shivered as he thought of the musket ball that had seared past his face, and the volley that had missed him only because he had stumbled. He lived because he had been lucky, not because he was quick or brave or cruel. His skill at battle meant nothing. The notion that there was nothing he could do to escape his destiny sickened him. He had struggled for years against the future that fate had allotted to him. He had refused to accept that there was just one path for him to follow, and he had fought and killed to prove his worth to a world that neither knew nor cared that he was capable of so much more than he was allowed. He felt his determination return. It did not matter if Palmer was right or if he was wrong. Jack could do nothing to control chance, but he did control his own actions. If he was not a soldier, he had nothing. He would not stop fighting, not now, not ever. "Move!" he bellowed. The Frenchmen were lingering in the blood-splattered room. They were no different to the redcoats he had led before. They were as brave as any and would fight hard when the need arose. But without leadership, they would do only what came naturally, and no sane man walked willingly back into battle. He had given the order expecting to be obeyed. He was roundly ignored, many of the men in the upper room simply staring at the foreigner in their midst, any earlier cooperation forgotten. A handful tried to leave of their own accord, but the stairs were blocked. Jack sheathed his bloody sabre, then shoved his revolver back into its holster before pushing forward to find out what was causing the delay. At least half a dozen Legionnaires milled around in the room below, blocking the exit. "For God's sake, get out of the way!" Jack shouted, trying to get them to move. He was pushed backwards, the Legionnaires refusing to listen to a civilian. One of the faces that turned to glare up at him belonged to a blonde-haired soldier wearing the blue of the Legion. It was a face Jack recognized at once, its likeness to a decade-old portrait startling. He had found Ballard's man. Chapter 28. "Stay right fucking there!" Jack jabbed a finger at the man with fair hair, who stared back at him, his mouth opening in surprise as he became the centre of attention. Jack pushed his way through the crowd of Legionnaires. It was not easy, and he had to use his elbows to force a passage downstairs. The blonde soldier had ignored the bellowed instruction and was already halfway out of the door when Jack reached the last step. "I told you to stay there!" Jack lunged forward and managed to grab his shoulder. "Who the devil do you think you are?" The man spun on his heel and shouted the question into Jack's face. "I've been ordered to find you." Jack kept a firm grip on his shoulder. The Legionnaires were trying to leave the house, and those behind him were buffeting him as he got in their way. "Your father sent us." My father? The blonde-haired man spat the words out like an oath. Jack winced as an elbow caught the pit of his spine. Come on, let's get out of here. Outside, the sounds of fighting were coming from every direction. Men screamed whilst others shouted orders. Rifle shots rang out constantly. The Austrians had taken heavy casualties, but they were not giving up the town without a fight. Say whatever it is you have to say, and say it quickly, snapped the Legionnaire. Your father wants you kept out of harm's way. What the hell does he care? The man scowled. I haven't clapped eyes on the miserable bastard for years. Jack felt a surge of relief. He had found his man. He would not have to go into any more houses or fight any more Austrians. Whatever ration of luck he had left would be saved for another day. I'm not going anywhere. The Englishman's face twisted with distaste at the idea. I have my duty. You don't have a fucking choice, chum. Jack would not let his quarry escape. Do not dare to tell me what to do. I'm sorry. I really am. Jack offered a smile. But I have my orders. The Colt slipped into his left hand with practiced ease. He pressed the barrel into the blonde-haired Legionnaire's gut. You don't have much of a say in the matter. The man looked at the gun poking into the soft flesh above his navel. He contemplated it for a moment, then raised his eyes so that he was looking Jack directly in the eye. Go to hell. He turned his head away and shouted, his French fast and fluent. Jack had no idea what was being said, but he knew it was not going to help his cause. Shut up! He snarled the words, his spittle flecking the man's cheeks. He was roundly ignored, the Englishman continuing to shout for aid. So he did the only thing he could think of. He slammed his fist directly into the man's mouth. The Legionnaire fell, hitting the ground on his backside, his shouts cut off in an instant. Jack was given no time to celebrate his success. Drop the gun, my friend, or by God I'll spread your brains all over the street. It was Jack's turn to feel the press of a gun barrel against his flesh. The man holding it was directly behind him, so he could not see who threatened him. The barrel was pushed forward with more purpose. Do it now. He thought about trying to fight, but the voice behind him was calm and devoid of emotion. He did not think a man who possessed a voice like that in the midst of a battle would fail to make good on such a threat, so he let his Colt fall from his hand. You bastard! The man he had knocked onto his arse snapped the insult as he saw the gun fall away. He smeared the back of his hand across his mouth, glancing down at the blood that smothered it before pushing himself to his feet. Jack lifted his chin and braced himself for the blow that he saw in the man's eyes. Hold it right there. The man behind Jack snapped the command as he saw the same thing. The blonde Legionnaire obeyed instantly, but still he leaned forward, pressing his bloodied face into Jack. Who the hell do you think you are? The man saving your sorry skin. And who the hell says I need my skin saving? Enough! The man behind Jack put an end to the argument, then shoved Jack hard in the back, spinning him around. Jack found himself staring into the face of Sergeant Carney, the American he had shared a train compartment with on the way out of Paris. Ah, I thought I knew you. Carney had recognized Jack at the same moment. What the hell are you doing here? I'm not here to fight. He pointed a finger at the blonde-haired man. But I'm going to take him with me. Carney laughed. No, you're not. He belongs to the Legion. Jack's hand slipped to the handle of his saber. He's English. His father sent me out here to take him back to England. That is what I intend to do." "Are you sure?" Carney laughed again. He gestured around him. "You gonna fight us all, then?" Jack had kept his eyes fixed on the American sergeant. Now he took a moment to see what was going on around him. They were not alone. At least a dozen legionnaires were watching the confrontation. Each was armed, and now every rifle was pointed towards Jack. Jack's hand fell away from his saber. "You're a wise fellow." Carney cocked an ear. The sound of fighting was louder than ever. "Now, we have a battle to fight." He looked past Jack. "Fleming, rejoin your group." The blonde-haired legionnaire snapped to attention, then did as he was told, his obedience immediate. Carney nodded once to Jack. "Do not try to interfere." He waved to his men. "En place!" The legionnaires formed up around their sergeant quickly and without a second word of command. Within moments they had moved off towards the fighting. The man Jack had knocked to the ground safely in their midst. Jack followed them doggedly. He had come a long way to find the man that Carney had addressed as Fleming. He would not let him go so easily. The Frenchman moved fast. The town was filled with the roar of battle, which grew steadily louder as they advanced. The fighting was brutal, with every street a battlefield, every building a strong point. The Austrians were making the French army pay in blood for every yard they captured. Bodies littered the ground. The dead and the dying lay amidst the rubble, while those with lighter wounds needed no urging to head to the rear, a steady procession of wounded men working their way away from the fighting. Carney's legionnaires pressed on through it all. Jack stayed with them, keeping his eyes on Fleming, the glimpse of blonde hair he could see underneath his kepi making it easy enough to keep him in sight. "Ici! Ici!" The legionnaires turned a corner and were immediately summoned into the fight. A party of 20 to 30 Zouaves were trying to force their way past a pair of massive wooden gates that blocked the entrance to a courtyard. The air was filled with the noise of their rifles hammering against the wood. The smallest of gaps opened in the massive timbers, and immediately musket fire spurted out through the opening. 2 Zouaves were cut down, their bodies falling back into the men behind them. The French soldiers roared with anger. Those nearest to the doors thrust their own rifles into the gap, returning fire as best they could. More French soldiers arrived from the opposite direction, their dark blue uniforms and green epaulettes identifying them as chasseurs. The fresh men joined the melee at the gate, adding their number to the press of bodies trying to fight their way inside. The legionnaires swarmed forward. Jack went with them. His boots caught a body and he looked down into the staring eyes of an Austrian corpse. The man had been shot in the breast, and his white tunic was smothered in blood. For an instant, an image of Jack's own face replaced that of the stranger, his skin tainted with the same waxy grey sheen of death, his sightless, lifeless eyes staring at nothing. The thought shocked him and he shivered. It was a glimpse into the future that waited for him, perhaps in just a minute's time. The notion sent a surge of ice surging into his gut. Fear followed, rabid, powerful, and churning deep in his bowels. Orders were being shouted over the chaos. The French general that Jack had seen earlier rode into the melee, the gold braid on his uniform making him stand out like a whore in a convent. He dismounted, ignoring the aides who were trying to grab his bridle and pull him away. Jack shook away his fear once again, refusing to let it master him. He pushed his way towards the gate. He would not hide from his fate. Galvanized by the presence of their general, the French pressed forward. The gap between the two massive doors was wider now. Jack could see dozens of Austrian musket barrels ram through it. Flames shot from the barrels as the defenders opened fire. At such close range, none could miss. Half a dozen French soldiers went down amidst the boots of their comrades, their deaths callously ignored by the men still trying to force their way into the courtyard. The French general charged forward, surrounded by Zouaves, Legionnaires, and chasseurs. Rifles opened fire at the gap between the gates. The defenders had no intention of yielding and fired back, their musket balls searing into the attackers, knocking them over like skittles at the fair. A great groan echoed through the French soldiers. The general had been hit. He fell backwards, his chest doused in blood. Willing hands hauled him away from the fighting. The sight goaded the attackers. Fresh men rushed the gates, their ranks packed deep as they sought to force their way in. Many fell, the Austrian defenders firing without pause. A tall French sapeur de génie arrived. He carried a huge axe which he slammed into the edge of the left-hand gate. He worked fast, ignoring the musket balls that zipped past him, tearing away the wood at the edge of the half-open gate. Another sapeur joined him. Together they hammered at the wood, whilst the men around them fired their rifles through the gap. The second sapeur was felled as a musket ball took him in the throat. A Zouave picked up the axe and took his place, attacking the gate with great, wild swings. The men around him cheered, the noise building in intensity even as the Zouave went down, a bayonet thrust through the gap to take him in the chest. The American Legionnaire Sergeant Kearney reached the gate. He grabbed a splintered plank of wood and ripped it away, screaming at his men to do the same. Dozens of pairs of hands followed suit, some men even dropping their rifles as they tore at the gates with their bare hands. The Austrians were still trying to hold their ground. The French soldiers gunned them down where they stood, dozens of rifles opening fire every time the gap widened. The screams were terrible as the French poured on the fire, the crowd of soldiers around the gate finally able to exact revenge for the men who had died. The surviving sapeur tore a whole plank away from its support. It was ripped away by Kearney, who threw it at the defenders. Again and again the two men attacked the gate until an entire section splintered, then gave way. With a great roar, the French soldiers stormed into the opening. Still the Austrians fought on. Some had managed to reload, and now the leading Frenchmen fell as close-range musket fire tore into their packed ranks. But the defenders were horribly outnumbered, and the French cheered as the Austrian line disappeared under a frenzy of bayonet thrusts. Jack went with the main rush. He stumbled over a dead Zouave and lost sight of Fleming. His head came up in time to see an Austrian counterattack surging towards the gate. The French saw it too and rushed towards it, the courtyard on the far side of the gates now a battlefield. The cobblestones were slick with spilt blood, and more than one man went down as his footing gave way. Jack could do nothing but press on as the mob of French soldiers surged forward. The man to his front died, an Austrian bayonet taking his throat, and Jack found himself in the front rank. He lunged, acting on instinct, his sabre darting forward to snatch away a man's eyes. Another Austrian came against him. The man screamed, his lips pulled back in an animal snarl as he tried to slide his bayonet into Jack's gut. He was still snarling as Jack sidestepped the bayonet, then drove his sabre through the man's throat, the sharpened steel gouging through the gristle with ease. "Come on!" Jack felt the battle madness grow. The fight was breaking up around him as the two sides became intermingled. A bayonet slid past his side, tearing through the hem of his jacket. He turned, his sabre slashing at the man who had nearly killed him. The blow missed, but the Austrian died as a Legionnaire buried his bayonet in the man's chest. Jack spied an Austrian officer leading a fresh group of men into the fight. He stamped forward, his boots catching a dying man in the face, and parried the enemy officer's first blow. The man glared at him. Then his gaze turned to the Legionnaire at Jack's side. The Frenchman's bayonet was still buried in the man he had struck down. The Austrian officer spotted the opportunity. He thrust his sword forward towards the Legionnaire's unprotected heart. Jack saw the blow coming. He was at the wrong angle to try to block it with his own sword, so he threw himself at the Austrian officer, hitting the man hard with his shoulder, driving the attack wide. The two men went down in a jumble of arms and legs, both hitting the ground hard. Jack's breath was driven from his body, but he punched his sword hilt down regardless. He felt the blow land, so he followed it with another, then another. The Austrian officer was writhing underneath him. Jack felt a fist slam into the side of his head. It hurt, but he punched down again, then battered his head forward, driving it into the centre of the Austrian's face. He felt something break underneath his forehead, so he pulled his head back, then slammed it forward again, all the while still punching with his sword. The body underneath him went limp. Jack staggered upright. His head throbbed and his vision greyed, but he still held his sabre ready to attack. There was no one left to fight. The French soldiers cheered. Some lifted their kepis or thrust their bloodied bayonets to the sky as they celebrated their bitter victory. The courtyard was like a butcher's yard. Bodies carpeted the ground, the white uniforms of the Austrians bright amidst the dark blue of the French. Some still moved, whilst others lay motionless, their bodies twisted into the impossible poses of the dead, their blood blackening the cobbles beneath. Jack stood straighter. He turned towards the man he had saved, and found himself looking at the blood-splattered face of the blonde-haired Legionnaire, Fleming. "It had to be you," Fleming spoke through gritted teeth. "Are you badly hurt?" Jack shook his head, wincing as the action sent a spasm of pain cascading through his skull. He took a deep breath, then pointed his bloody sabre at the man Ballard wanted so badly. "Don't go anywhere." The Legionnaire grimaced at such belligerence. "Don't worry." He looked around him. "I don't think any of us are going anywhere for the moment." Jack followed his gaze. The surviving French soldiers were moving between the heaps of bodies as they began the bitter task of sorting the living from the dead. The sounds of fighting were dying away, the last of the Austrian defenders pulling out. The French had captured the town. Chapter 29. Jack sucked gratefully on a canteen of water as he sat on the ground with his back against the wall of the courtyard. He let his head fall back so that it rested on the wall. The stone was cool against his scalp, and he closed his eyes as he savoured the momentary peace. He sat amongst the Legionnaires. Sergeant Carney was still there, but only half of the men he had led into the bitter fight were left standing. "So who are you?" Fleming sat at his side. It was his square canteen that Jack was drinking from, the pair sitting in wary silence as the survivors of the fight slumped on whatever ground they could find that was not occupied by a corpse or a dying man. "Jack Lark." Jack drank again, swilling the water around his mouth before he swallowed it. Try as he might, he could not lose the taste of spent powder. "Well met, Jack Lark." Fleming looked down at his hand, then after a moment's thought, offered it to Jack. "My name's James Fleming, although most of these buggers insist on calling me Jacques." "Is that your real name?" Jack summoned the energy to shake Fleming's hand. "Does it matter?" "No, I suppose not." Jack was bone-weary, and the headbutts he had thrown in the fight made it feel as if he had cracked his skull. He did not care what the man he had come for was called. "You've put us all to a great deal of trouble." He handed back the canteen. "I never asked for that. I never asked for you to come. But we came anyway. Your father's keen for you to return to England. He wants you to be safe." "My father?" Fleming scoffed. My father wanted nothing to do with me for years. His precious career came first. Can you understand what that feels like? To know that your father is more concerned about his bloody job than he is about his only son. I don't care. Jack rested his head against the wall again to lessen the odds of it falling from his shoulders. You're still coming with me. Fleming gave a short bark of a laugh. You can stop that nonsense. It really is getting rather tiresome. I'm not leaving. I'll make you, if I have to. Fleming laughed again, louder this time. Look around you, Jack. One word from me and any one of these bastards will slit your throat without so much as batting an eyelid. It wouldn't be the first time, and I very much doubt that it would be the last. Jack opened his eyes and looked around. Sergeant Carney was sitting with his legionnaires. All were keeping a careful eye on the man in civilian clothes who had fought like a devil and who now sat in their midst. I will give you a message, though. Fleming caught Jack's eye and offered a tight-lipped smile. One you can pass on to that dear old father of mine. The smile disappeared. Tell him to go to hell. Jack saw the passion in the younger man's face. He did not doubt the sincerity behind the message that he would have to give to Ballard. Jack. The voice came from the entrance to the courtyard. For a moment Jack held Fleming's gaze, only looking away when the voice called again. I can see you sitting there on your great fat arse, Mr. Jack fucking Lark. The easily recognisable form of Palmer was standing in the broken gateway. With a groan, Jack got to his feet. He waved a greeting at Palmer, then looked down at the Legionnaire he had followed into battle. This isn't over. Yes, it is. The reply was given through gritted teeth. There was nothing else to be said. Jack forced his abused body into motion and went to give Ballard the news. What the devil do you mean? Ballard shouted the words into Jack's face with such force that specks of spittle landed on his cheeks. It was dusk, and they stood alone on the roadway a dozen or so yards from the first aid station where Jack had left the rest of the party. Palmer had gone to round up Mary and Billy, leaving Jack to face Ballard alone. I found him. He refused to come with me. Jack had no strength left for temper. I didn't expect you to damn well ask him. What do you think would happen? Jack's voice kept its even tone. You wanted me to fight a dozen legionnaires? If that is what it would have taken to bring the boy to me, then yes, that is exactly what I would have expected you to do. Well, more fool you. Be careful who you call fool, Ballard snapped at the lure. I'm calling you a fool for sending me on a fool's errand. Jack fired the words back with icy venom. I found your man, and I gave him the fucking message. If you want to go and get him, then be my bloody guest. See if you have any more luck convincing his mates to let him go than I did. You should not have given them the choice. Ballard did not back down. Jack bit his tongue. I saw no other way. No, you never do, for that would involve thinking. Ballard's eyes narrowed as he glared at Jack. I see that you are only capable of obeying an exact order. He pushed his face closer to Jack's. The next time you will do exactly what I tell you to do. You will not deviate from those orders, even if the Archangel Gabriel himself arrives and begs you to do otherwise. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Good. Ballard said the word with difficulty. He composed himself with visible effort. This is not over. The lad doesn't want to go home. Jack could not hold his tongue, even if it meant tweaking the tail of the devil himself. He told me to give his father a message. What was it? Ballard's words were chilled. To leave him alone. Jack did not shirk from the Major's gaze. Ballard's expression was unreadable. It changes nothing, We must still take this boy to his father. He's no boy. He's a man doing what he thinks is right. He is a boy who knows nothing. Ballard shouted the words. There is no discussion on this matter. He managed to bring his temper under control, but said nothing else before he turned sharply on his heel and stormed away, leaving Jack to stare silently at his back. He stood there for several minutes until he heard footsteps approach. He looked over his shoulder to see Palmer and Mary coming towards him. "You found him, then?" Palmer spoke first. There was mockery in his tone. "I did." "But you didn't think to keep hold of the bugger?" "No." Jack sighed. "I should have let you try. You might have had more luck." "I doubt it." Palmer grunted his reply. "Where were you?" Jack could not help the question sounding like an accusation. "I was busy." Jack looked down at Palmer's hands. There was black blood under his nails, and a series of deep scratches across one cheek and behind his left ear. They looked like claw marks. He did not doubt the larger man's assertion. "Is he worth it?" It was Mary who asked the question. She stood between the two men, looking at them both in turn. "Worth what, exactly?" "You. Both of you. Both of your lives." Jack looked Palmer up and down. "He's certainly worth Palmer's life. Not so bloody sure about mine." Mary tutted at the glib reply. "I mean it. What makes one of him worth the two of you?" The two men shared a look. Jack answered for them both, trying to make light of the question. "He's a rich boy from a rich family. That makes him worth a dozen of the likes of us." "Maybe Jack's right. Maybe he isn't." Palmer gave his own answer earnestly. "But the Major says this man is worth it, so that's good enough for me." Jesus Christ. Jack winced at the response. It was the second time Palmer had made such a simple assertion, and it did not grate on Jack any less for the repetition. "I would never have put you down as a lick-spittle." "Jack!" Mary snapped a warning. "All right." Jack held up a hand, acknowledging her words. He looked at Palmer. "Whatever he has on you, it must be bloody good." Palmer grunted. "You have no idea." "No. That's not right." Mary laid a hand on Palmer's arm. "We have every idea. I'm a washed-up doxy, and he's—" She paused to flap her hand in Jack's direction. "He's just a dolt who thinks he's clever enough to fool the world when really the only person he's fooling is himself." She turned her attention on Palmer. "Whatever it is, I'm certain it won't shock the likes of us." Palmer offered her a grim smile. "We make a fine team. A fool, a whore, and a murderer." "So, who did you kill?" Jack wanted to know what drove a man like Palmer into such blind obedience. "Just a man," Palmer sighed. "He deserved it, I know that for sure, but that wouldn't have stopped them stretching my neck for it." He looked up, searching the sky as he continued. "You see, the problem for me was that the bastard was rich. He liked to drink, this fine fellow of mine, and he liked to race his damn carriage about like he owned the streets of London. One night he had an accident. Nothing serious, just broke a wheel on his carriage and knocked over a bench. Not enough to bother a great lord like that. Except for the fact that he killed someone." Palmer looked down. "He killed my wife. And no one gave a shit. Just an accident, they said, just one of those things." He vibrated with passion. "So I killed the bastard in cold blood. And I said her name over and over, so it was the last thing he ever heard." He took a deep breath before he continued, the words flowing out of him now that he had let them free. "I was found out by a friend of the man I killed, an officer in Army intelligence. I would have hung, but this man, well, he offered me a way out. My daughter, he choked on the word. I was all she had. If I'd let them take me away, she would have had nothing. You know what happens to girls like that. He looked up at Mary as he made the statement. Mr. Ballard found her a place. She's a good girl and she's doing well now, thanks to Mr. Ballard. He glanced down, his eyes moist. You understand now? He shook his head, as if annoyed to have given away so much about himself, then looked Jack hard in the eye. I owe him everything. He turned his wet eyes back on the sky, searching for a glimpse of the stars that watched over them all with such serenity. Jack absorbed the confession. Is that all? The glib reply fell flat. Mary placed her hand back on Palmer's arm. Your daughter has a fine future ahead of her. That's a good thing. I hope so. Palmer sucked air through his teeth. By God, I hope it's enough. Mary kept her hand in place. It's everything. I would do anything for my Billy to give him a good future, anything at all. Jack heard the feeling behind her words. He could not share her sentiments. She and Palmer had children, people they loved and who loved them in turn. He had no one. Ballard bustled into the small camp, a hemp sack in each hand. No one had said much following Palmer's confession. They had set up camp where they were, waiting dutifully for the Major to return. Dusk had turned into night. They had eaten a meal of bread and cheese as they sat on the ground, and made themselves as comfortable as they could so close to a field of battle. Ballard walked close to the fire that Jack had got going with powder from a cartridge from his revolver. He dumped one sack in front of Jack and the other in front of Palmer. What's this? Presents? Jack tried to read his commander's face in the light cast by the fire. He failed. Ballard's habitual assured expression was firmly back in place. There is a new plan. The reply was clipped. Go on. Jack could not help but sound dubious. Open it. Ballard turned to make sure Palmer was also paying attention. Jack did as he was told. He pulled out a uniform coatee, the fabric coarse under his fingers. He held it towards the firelight and recognized it immediately. It was the uniform jacket of the French Foreign Legion, the men he had fought alongside that afternoon. You want us to join the Legion? He posed the question as he dug deeper into the sack. His fingers felt the shape of a French kepi, along with trousers and what he thought to be gaiters. No, Jack. I don't want you to join the Legion. Ballard made sure that both men were looking at him before he continued. But the next time you will not ask our target's permission. These uniforms will get you close. When the time is right, you will strike him down and take him away. No one will question two men dragging a wounded comrade to safety. His eyes glimmered in the firelight. There are just two rules. You keep him alive, and you bring him to me no matter what it takes. No matter the cost. Yes, Jack. No matter the cost. Ballard glowered at him. You will not fail me twice. Chapter 30. Jack was bored. He kicked at a stone and watched it skitter along the road until it cracked against a tree. The sound made the mule start, and it brayed in protest until Billy managed to calm it. It was the third draining day of marching. None had been particularly long, but the French advance was slowed by frequent halts that left the men and the small party of British agents in their midst to endure hour after hour in the relentless sun, choking on dust and kicking their heels. The Austrians were retreating faster than the French could advance. They destroyed every bridge after they had crossed it, forcing the French to build a series of pontoon bridges, each of which only added to the maddeningly long halts. So far they had crossed 4 rain-swollen rivers, and there were many more between them and Milan, the Austrian-held capital of Lombardy. Jack wiped a hand across his sweat-streaked face. He had shed his outer layers, so walked in only a loose shirt and breeches, yet he still felt disgusting. He smiled as Palmer stood in stoic silence at his side. Ballard's man still wore his thick tweeds, as if going for a day's hunting in the wilds of Scotland rather than trampling across the Lombard plain. There was little news to brighten the tiresome march. A reconnaissance force of French cavalry had clashed with the Austrian rearguard at a place called Legionnaire. The skirmish had escalated quickly, but neither the French First Corps nor MacMahon's Second Corps could get to the front fast enough to turn it into a major engagement. First Corps managed to reach the fighting late in the afternoon, but succeeded only in providing some target practice for the Austrian artillery. The battle had done little to improve either side's prospects of a convincing victory. Jack and Palmer had been given no opportunity to don their new uniforms and try to abduct their target in the chaos of a skirmish, something that vexed Ballard no end. The Major had taken to spending more and more of his time with the staff officers who served the newly promoted Maréchal MacMahon. He returned only rarely to remind Jack and Palmer of their duty. The only person he had a kind word for was Mary, his mood improving markedly when he passed a moment or two engaging her in conversation. The column they were following started to move off. Jack forced his tired feet into motion. He marched like a redcoat, his mind idling through the interminable hours, his world reduced to the ground beneath his boots and the backs of the infantrymen in the regiment to his front. "Oh, for God's sake!" He could not help but swear as the column ground to yet another halt. He doubted they had covered more than 500 yards since the last stop. "Stop your whining." Mary walked alongside him. She still had enough energy to chastise him. She too had reduced her layers of clothing so that she walked in just a simple cotton shift. She was still hot and sweaty, and the dress clung to her in ways that Jack found altogether too distracting. "I've got a bone to pick with you." Her tone was glacial. "What have I done now?" Jack found his eyes lingering on the shape of Mary's figure. He forced them away with reluctance. Her expression made it clear that she had spotted his scrutiny and that it was not appreciated. "You've been teaching Billy to use that damn gun of yours." "Was that all?" Jack had expected worse. "What the hell are you thinking?" "It's nothing." "It flaming well is not nothing." Mary's temper was firing. "You leave my boy alone. He already wants to be like you. Don't bloody well encourage him." Jack barked with laughter, but cut it short when he saw the glare in her eyes. It was flattering to think that Billy had taken a shine to him. He wanted to learn. He's a bright lad. He tried to mollify her. "Which is why I don't want you filling his head with all sorts of nonsense about becoming a bloody redcoat." "Was good enough for me." "Being a street sweeper was good enough for you. You leave Billy alone." "He might need to know how—" "No." Mary cut him short. "He's not here to fight. You keep him out of harm's way, you hear me, Jack? That boy's here only because of you, so you keep him safe and stop trying to make him like you." Jack sighed. "I'll do my best." "You had better do more than that." "Jesus Christ, Mary." Jack was trying hard to bite his tongue. "I can't help it if the boy looks up to me." Mary's eyes narrowed. "Don't worry. I'll tell him what you're really like. Just make sure you do your bit and leave him well alone." "All right." The simple agreement took some of the wind out of Mary's sails. "You make sure you do." "Is that all?" "For now." "Good." Jack snapped the answer as an idea formed in his mind. He wanted a change of company, and he knew where to go to find it. Jack picked his way through the soldiers' encampment. The Legion was well drilled and used to setting up a temporary home at the end of the day's march. General McMahon had ordered his Second Corps to a halt as the sun set, another long day of little progress coming to an end. He was impressed by what he saw. Even though the column had only been halted for half an hour, they had already laid out their three-man tents in an ordered grid of parallel lines. With that done, the Legionnaires had settled to their dinner. Jack's stomach rumbled as he walked past cauldron after cauldron filled with rice, onions, and bacon. Some of the soldiers were sitting playing lotto, the Legionnaire's favourite pastime, and he felt a strong sense of longing to be back with men for whom a campfire like this was home. He'd come to the army when he had nothing else. He'd never expected to find the camaraderie that made his life in the ranks so enjoyable. The days with his mates were some of the rare memories that did not haunt him. A large part of him yearned to be able to return to the simple life of a redcoat, a life not burdened by responsibility or the bounds of ambition. There were times when he felt like a fool for having walked away from it, his decision to try to climb above his station costing him in so many more ways than he could ever have imagined. "What the hell do you want with us now?" Jack was startled out of his reverie. He had been spotted. "Sergeant Carney." He nodded a greeting at the Legion sergeant, who had spied him wandering close to his fire. Carney shook his head. "Don't you ever give up?" "No, not as a rule. Is he about?" Carney nodded at a fire a dozen yards away. "He's just over there, but I doubt he'll appreciate your visit. Like I give a shit." Carney chuckled at the belligerent reply. "You two should get along fine. You're very much alike." Jack snorted at the idea. "I doubt it." "Then you would be wrong." The sergeant was sitting comfortably on the ground, and now he stretched his legs out in front of him, totally at ease with his surroundings. "But I reckon you don't listen too well, so I'll hold my peace." Jack grinned. He liked Carney. The man was at one with his place in the world. He had a sureness about him that Jack had seen in the best non-commissioned officers. Men needed that calming influence in battle. It held them steady so much more effectively than even the harshest disciplinarian ever could. "Now that's the first wise thing I've ever heard you say." He dawdled at Carney's fire. "You're a long way from home, Sergeant." Carney shrugged. "I am home." He gestured around him. "I belong here more than I belong in Boston." Jack understood the feeling. Still, it's a strange place to find an American. It's the Legion. We all came from somewhere, and we all found our way here. We do our duty, and we learn not to ask about a man's past. Jack heard the warning in the words. "So, do you mind if I talk to your chum?" "So long as that's all it is," Carney smiled. "If I hear anything else, so help me, I'll slit your throat myself." Jack laughed at the certainty behind the words. "I hope it never comes to that." He was not joking. He did not fancy the notion of fighting Carney. "Then don't let it." Carney grinned. "Stop by on your way back. I reckon I've still got some more of that arak somewhere." "I'll do that." Jack nodded his thanks and went to find his man. "Would it make a difference if I damned your eyes and told you to bugger off?" Fleming greeted Jack as soon as he approached the Legionnaire's fire. He sat with one other man, the two of them staring silently at a small cauldron filled with simmering water as they waited for it to soften up the day's ration of bacon enough to make it edible. "No." Jack had decided on total honesty. "Mind if I sit down?" "Yes." "That's not very civil." He sat down regardless. "Smells good." "It won't taste it. It's more gristle than meat. But if we boil it long enough, it should be all right. If not, we'll leave the bloody thing cooking overnight, then eat it in the morning." Jack smiled at the experienced opinion. Many would-be soldiers joined the ranks for little more than the promise of regular food, but even the hungriest soldier quickly tired of the basic rations all armies fed their men, the rancid meat possessing little to recommend it. "You can share our dinner. Save it going to waste." Fleming sat forward and gave the stew a half-hearted stir. His messmate peered inside the cauldron, then shook his head before getting up and disappearing inside the tent, leaving Jack and Fleming alone by the fire. "That's good of you. I won't say no." Jack nodded his thanks for the offer. He had not failed to notice that there were just 2 men sharing the food, whilst 3 sat round most of the other campfires. He was not enough of a fool to ask where the 3rd man might be. The recent fighting had claimed plenty of lives, and the Legion had lost its fair share. "Why are you here?" Fleming gave up stirring the pot and looked keenly at Jack. "I was going to ask you the same question." "Then this is going to be a dull conversation." Fleming shook his head at the idea, then sighed. "I am here because I was tired of being in the way." He kept his eyes on Jack as he offered the explanation. "I do not expect you to understand." "I don't." Jack's reply was sharp. "Most men join the ranks because life has shat on them so badly that being a soldier looks better than the cruddy existence they face outside. You had everything they could ever have dreamt of, more even. Yet here you are, eating the same vile grub and fighting anyone you're told to. It doesn't make much sense to me." "No, put like that, it doesn't make much sense to me either." Fleming chuckled at Jack's description. "But I wouldn't change it. I belong here now. I chose this life. I don't want to give it up." His eyes narrowed. "I won't give it up." "You like it that much?" "No, not all the time. But I found I have a taste for this life. My old one was all mapped out for me, what schools I would attend, what career I would follow, even what woman I should marry. I wasn't given a say in any of it." His deepening scowl was replaced by a smile. "So I buggered off to come here. The Legion took me in. They didn't ask me whose son I was or what school I had attended. I gave them a made-up name and they accepted me, no questions asked." Jack listened carefully. He knew only a little about the Legion, soldiers' rumours and campfire gossip rather than anything factual. Fleming's tale was intriguing, and Jack found himself feeling almost envious. It was a tempting option to become someone new. A man's past could be lost and might possibly even be forgotten. "So your life was terrible?" He wanted to know more, to try to understand what drove a man who had every advantage in life to give it all up for a place as a common soldier in the service of a foreign power. "I hated not having a choice." Fleming offered a thin smile at the admission. "I'm sure you don't understand, but I could not bear to sit there and just plod my way along the path they had set out for me. It is my life. I will choose how I live it. I shall not be told, not by my family, not by my father, and most certainly, Jack, not by you." Jack smiled at such determination. He came from a very different world, the rookeries of London bearing no comparison to the life of a rich man's son. Yet much of what Fleming said could have come from his own mouth. Fate had chosen a path for him and he had rejected it, becoming an impostor to prove that he could be so much more than he was allowed. Such naive ambition had been washed away in the blood of the battlefield, but he could well remember the burning desire to fight against his fate. "So I cannot convince you to come with me?" His smile widened as he spoke. "No. You will have to kill me first." The bold challenge was made with a grin. "Is that all? You should have said." Jack laughed. "Then I could have shot your bollocks off the first time I saw you, and we wouldn't be having this dull conversation." Fleming guffawed. "I like you, Jack. You're full of shit, but I like you. So when will you tell me your tale? Why are you here?" "I had nowhere else to go," Jack replied with honesty. Besides, I'm being rewarded for doing this. They're paying you to take me back to my dear old pater's side. Yes. And my sorry tale did not convince you to leave me alone? No. Jack placed a hand on Fleming's shoulder. No offence, but I still have to get you away from all of this. People are depending on me. I cannot let them down. Not again. His voice trailed off. The memory of his mother's death flickered into his mind, the flames of the campfire becoming those of the burning gin palace. An image of his mother's face in the moment before she died formed in his mind's eye. She was shouting at him, telling him to leave, to get away. Jack? He started. The image fled as he forced the memories away. They're awful buggers, aren't they? The memories. Fleming was watching Jack's face closely. You've been around a bit. You have the same look in your eyes as some of the boys who have served for a long time, like you're looking at something 1,000 yards away. Jack shook off the chill that the memory of his mother's face had sent rushing through his veins. The notes of a bugle call prevented him from answering. The sound came clearly in the night. It signalled the end of the day and summoned men to the first watch of the night. He stood up and bashed the dust from his backside. I think I'll leave you in peace. He nodded towards the bubbling cauldron. That smells like shit. Fleming laughed dutifully, but his eyes did not reflect any sign of humour. He got up too and held out his hand. I rather think we could have been friends, you and I. Jack shook the hand being offered to him. Perhaps. He sighed. I still have to come for you. You can try. Jack nodded. There was nothing more to be said. He had come to find out more about the man that Ballard had ordered him to take away, perhaps even to convince him to come without any more fuss. He'd expected to find a fool, someone he would despise. He had not expected to find a man cut from the very same cloth as himself. Chapter 31. The mysterious object was almost motionless in the sky, swaying gently from side to side in the breeze. It looked like some monstrous bird flying into the wind, the unearthly calm unsettling. What the hell do you think it is? Jack screwed his eyes tight against the eyepiece of his field glasses. They watered with the effort, but he could just about make out a large basket hanging from underneath the monstrous beast. He thought he could see 2 or 3 men inside it, but the distance was too great and he gave up the struggle. Witchcraft! Billy spoke in reverential tones, his voice betraying a mix of fear and excitement. You daft bugger! Mary clipped her son's head for such a foolish answer. Jack? Jack laughed off the boy's fear. It's not witchcraft, lad, but blow me if I know how that thing works. It is a balloon, Ballard answered. He was spending a rare morning with them, and now he held out a hand. May I borrow your glasses, Jack? Jack handed them over. He had not seen a contraption like the one ahead before, and he was intrigued. Ah, that is better. This really is a fine pair of glasses, Jack. The man you stole them from must curse you daily for their loss. Oh, I pinched him, not Jack, Billy piped up, puffing out his chest as he did so. You really should not brag about such delinquent behaviour, William. It will lead to no end of trouble. Ballard spoke whilst still studying the balloon. His habit of addressing Mary's son as William never failed to make the boy scowl and his mother smile. That really is a marvel of modern engineering. He lowered the glasses, then handed them back to Jack, his expression revealing his fascination with the machine that had so concerned Billy. We are lucky to see... Lucky? Jack interrupted. He was trying hard to forget the close quarter fighting in the town that he now knew was called Magenta. I doubt the fellows who had their guts ripped out the other day would say they'd been lucky. Ballard flicked a hand to brush off such a dark retort. You know full well that I do not mean it like that. What I would have said if you would just let me finish— he sounded peevish as he was forced into the longer explanation— is that we are lucky to see a truly modern war. One where industry and engineering will play as much of a part as the generals and their armies. The French seem to have grasped that fact rather faster than the Bally Habsburgs. Their cannon are superior thanks to modern manufacturing methods, as are their rifles. Their ability to manoeuvre is better thanks to their use of the railways. Now the Austrians are using balloons as observation posts, and whilst that is to their credit, I do not fancy it will win them any battles. Will there be another battle? Billy asked the question eagerly. I very much doubt it. Ballard smiled at the boy. At least not for some time. Jack winced at the expression he saw on his master's face. He was trying to win the boy over, but to Jack's mind the sickly smile looked rather as though he was attempting to coerce him into an unwelcome proposition. The Austrians are retreating. Ballard continued his explanation. They show no intention of stopping this side of the quadrilateral. The what? Jack could not help but ask the question he knew Ballard wanted to hear. The quadrilateral, Ballard repeated. For many years now, the Austrian generals have relied on the strength of their fortresses to dominate these lands. They have 4 major fortresses to the south of Lake Garda: Peschiera, Verona, Legnano, and Mantua. Together they make for a vast, entrenched battleground. It is the opinion of the French High Command that the Austrian commanders are seeking a return to this strong defensive position. No, there will be no battle. At least not any time soon. There will be a battle. Jack enjoyed pricking his master's bubble of confidence. And soon. Why do you say that? Ballard's scowl was immediate. I've heard that the French patrols have been coming across many more enemy reconnaissance parties than before. Now there's that blasted thing. Jack gestured at the distant balloon. The Austrians are taking more notice of where the French are and where they're going. I reckon that means they aim to stop them. Ballard harumphed. I fancy the French High Command does not share your opinion. Perhaps they should ask for it. I'm sure the view of a charlatan would be most welcome. He smiled, pleased with the jibe. I'd be happy to tell them. Jack met the barb with deadpan seriousness. I am sure you would, you scoundrel. Ballard was enjoying himself, and not even Jack's contrary opinion could harm his high spirits. You don't believe me? On this occasion I shall trust the opinion of the Maréchal. I'll prove it to you if you like. Jack made the offer with a smile. He had spotted a small village that hugged the ridge around half a mile from the line of march. It was not a grand place, but he could see that it possessed a church with a small spire. We could go over there. He pointed across to the tower. I reckon that will let us see what's ahead. If I'm right, I think we'll spot the Austrians. I would say your friend the Maréchal would be rather impressed if you were the one to tell him what was what. Ballard's eyes followed the direction of Jack's pointing finger. A thoughtful expression crept over his face as he contemplated the suggestion. I think it might be worth the effort. He turned and nodded to Jack. How lovely it would be for a British observer to point out the facts of the matter before the Maréchal's own reconnaissance forces. He paused as he made up his mind. I think we shall do it. Mary, I shall leave Palmer to watch over you and young William. He gave his orders quickly before rewarding Jack with one of his odd smiles. I say, Jack, shall we go for a little stroll? The village was quiet. It was mid-morning and most of the locals would be out working the fields, but there was still enough around to stare at the 2 men who walked along the main road that passed through the village's centre. By the time Jack and Ballard had reached the small square to the front of the church, a priest was waiting for them. "Bonjour, monsieur." The priest opened his arms as he greeted them in French. He was not old, but his hair was thin, and he was thick enough around the waist to be well into middle age. "Good afternoon, father," Ballard replied. "I'm afraid we are English, not French." "Ah, then in that case perhaps I should say welcome, gentlemen." The priest's English was good, his Italian accent barely noticeable. "Thank you." Ballard walked towards him. "I am Major Ballard of the British Army, currently serving Maréchal MacMahon of His Majesty's French forces. This is my man, Lark. A good morning to you both." The priest bobbed his head in greeting. "My name is Father Dinesi, and I welcome you to our humble village." "Thank you for such a warm greeting." Ballard was clearly enjoying the formalities. "Your English is very good indeed." Dinesi inclined his head at the compliment. "I was fortunate to spend some time in your beautiful country when I was a younger man. At Canterbury, a most beautiful city. Now," he clapped his hands together, "perhaps I can offer you a little food, or is it accommodation you are searching for?" "Thank you, father, but all we require is the opportunity to climb your tower." "Ah, a reconnaissance." The priest seemed relieved that his visitors could be pleased so easily. "Yes, of course. I shall show you myself. Please, if you will follow me." He beckoned for Jack and Ballard to follow as he set off towards the church. "So, I'm your man now." Jack spoke out of the side of his mouth as they trailed after the priest. Who knew promotion could be so rapid? "Do be quiet, Jack, there's a good fellow." Ballard could not help a half-smile from creeping onto his face. "We're getting on so famously, it would be a shame to spoil it with your recalcitrance." The steps that led to the top of the tower smelled of damp and mould. The priest went first, his feet kicking up a fine cloud of dust. The climb was long enough to have their breath catching in their throats and their knees and thighs protesting, but the view when they emerged from the gloom of the stairwell was spectacular. Dinesi led them to the edge of the narrow parapet that surrounded the pinnacle of the tower, his face creased into an indulgent smile as he saw their delight. "It is beautiful, is it not? A reminder of God's hand at work, I think." He clasped his hands together and stood back so as not to interrupt his guest's view of the landscape. For once Jack did not disagree with the invocation of God's name. The tower was the perfect vantage point, and the priest was right to be proud of the vista. In the bright morning sunlight, the countryside looked pristine and tranquil, the patchwork of wheat fields, grassland and woods simply stunning. He moved to the side facing east, the direction in which the French army was advancing, careful not to lean against the rough-hewn stone parapet that was all that stood between him and a fatal plunge to the square below. A steep ridge ran west to east, its slopes covered with vines, mulberry trees and great fields of wheat. A handful of small villages broke up the lush countryside, their red roofs bright against so much greenery. It was a picture of rural bliss, the scene likely to have been unchanged for centuries. "Permit me to tell you what you see." The priest had followed Jack and now held out an arm, his finger pointing towards the first of the villages nestled so perfectly into the countryside that it appeared it had formed there naturally. "Let us start on our left. The village you can see closest to us on the western side of the ridge is Castiglione. There, to its right, nestled into the foot of the slope, is Grole. The larger one, up on the centre of the crest, is Solferino. You see the tall tower at its centre. That is called the Spear d'Italia, the spy of Italy, you would say. I have to confess that the view from there is perhaps finer than the one you see before you, but please do not tell Father Bellini, if you meet him, that I admitted to that. Danesi chuckled at his own humour before continuing his description. To the south of Solferino and on the slope of the ridge itself is San Cassiano, with Monte Fontana just behind. Then at the end of the ridge, just before the last hilltop, that is Volta. The view across the Campo di Medole to the south is magnificent from there. Jack did his best to remember the names. On the slope that led up to the village that Father Danesi had named as Solferino were a handful of small streams, their banks lined with thick bands of vegetation. A single minor road led directly along the ridgeline from Castiglione to Solferino, and another, larger road ran along the base of the ridge before heading southeast. He turned his head, following the path the road took as it meandered away. It led him to look out to the south, where the great plain that Danesi had called the Campo di Medole stretched for miles. There the ground was wide and open, and covered with vast fields of maize, wheat, barley and rye that rippled in the breeze that washed across them. It is a beautiful view. Ballard had come to stand at Jack's side. It is that. Jack had seen enough. The view from the church tower was indeed spectacular, and the ridge with its charming villages, lush greenery and pretty meandering streams was a classic example of the beauty of Lombardy. He reached down to his hip to free his field glasses from their leather case and lifted them to his eyes. Within a few seconds he had spied the first Austrian troops, clustered around the villages of Solferino and San Cassiano. It did not take him much longer to pan along the ridge and see the preparations that were being made. He lowered the glasses and handed them to Ballard. "Take a look at Solferino." He pointed out the village, then stood back slightly to give his commander a better view. "I see them." Ballard moved slightly as he studied the ridge. He lowered the field glasses, then gave Danesi one of his odd little smiles. "Father, could we have a moment?" "Of course. You have military matters to discuss that even a man of the cloth should not overhear." "I thank you for your understanding." Danesi inclined his head to acknowledge Ballard's politeness. "I will leave you now, but please take care on the way down. The steps can be treacherous, and I would not have it said that I was the cause of injuring a British officer or his man." He gave Jack a half smile as he backed away and made for the stairs. Ballard waited, his head cocked to one side as he listened to the sound of the priest's footsteps on the stone stairs. Only when he was satisfied that they were truly alone did he fix his gaze on Jack. "So, they have turned." "Looks like it. Makes sense, too. Each one of those villages makes a perfect strong point to anchor their line." Jack was running his eyes over the ridge. He could see the places where the Austrian generals would deploy their men. There was little room for Napoleon to manoeuvre. The French could advance as far as Castiglione. From there they would be forced to move on to Solferino, which appeared to be a natural fortress. The road that led there narrowed on the approach, tottering along a knife-edge ridge, the last few hundred yards overlooked by a series of high walls and what appeared to be some sort of church or castle. The walls looked solid even from a distance, and the Austrians would be sure to prepare a strong defensive position. The ground to the south of Solferino looked more inviting. The great open plain of the Campo di Medole favoured cavalry and horse artillery. It would also give the French infantry space to manoeuvre. With the ridge too narrow to support a wide advance, Napoleon would be forced to commit troops to the plain. Any fighting there would be more in the classic style, with all three arms of both armies working in unison. Jack looked northwards. He could see little of the terrain on the far side of the ridge, save for another village perched high on a hilltop far in the distance. He could only guess that Napoleon would send more troops in that direction, the fight for the ground to the northern side of the ridge forming the French army's left flank. With Solferino in the centre, and the great plain on the right, Jack got a sense of the ground that he believed would likely see a battle in the coming days. The enormous swathe of land looked serene and peaceful in the morning sunshine, but if the armies did fight, the beautiful countryside would be devastated. It'll be a bugger of a job to shift all those bastards off that ridge. He gave the verdict solemnly. Now, I do see what you mean, agreed Ballard. Their men will still need to stand. It all comes down to that at the end of the day. Ballard nodded. Let us see what else we can see, shall we? He gestured for Jack to follow him to the other side of the tower. Goodness me, would you look at that? He had not placed Jack's field glasses to his eyes for more than a few moments before he made the exclamation. Jack did not need the fancy glasses to make out what had caused such a reaction. As far as the eye could see, the roads were clogged with men and the material of war. The French army was simply enormous, with great columns of men, horses, artillery wagons, limbers, commissary carts, and ambulances stretching back for miles. So the Austrians are being bold. Ballard had seen enough. He lowered the field glasses and handed them back to Jack. And therefore there will be a battle. If the French numbers and their estimates of the Austrian strength are accurate, it could be the biggest battle the world has ever seen. Jack stared at the huge French columns. He could not contradict Ballard's claim. Nothing he had ever seen had been on this scale. If the Austrian army was as vast as the French horde, the forthcoming battle would indeed be cataclysmic in scale. We shall have our chance. Ballard came to stand nearer to Jack. You can do what you were brought here to do. Jack could feel the wash of breath on his cheek. His commander was uncomfortably close. Do not let me down again, Jack. Ballard lowered his voice, speaking barely louder than a whisper. You must get the boy away. He will be in dreadful danger. His words caught in his throat. You must find him, and you must keep him from harm. Jack felt a chill at the back of his neck. Tens of thousands of men were marching to their deaths, and he would have to take his place in their ranks. Chapter 32. The French army awoke long before dawn. It did so quietly, the men silent, and the sergeants and corporals limiting themselves to hoarse whispers as they made sure their troops were ready. Even the musicians' instruments were mute, the army rousing itself without any of its usual fanfare. The men drank a hasty morning coffee before leaving their knapsacks behind. Many looked wistfully at their belongings, their worldly goods abandoned save for a keepsake or memento kept for luck. To a man, they wondered if they would see them again. How many knapsacks would be left in the heap, unclaimed and free to be rifled through by those left alive? Good hunting, Jack. Ballard offered his hand. It was still dark. The only light came from their campfire, and it left much of their faces in shadow. The two of them were standing alone underneath the black flag of a first aid station. They had spent the night in one of the buildings that had been requisitioned as a temporary hospital for the following day. One of the pair of French surgeons assigned to the station had arrived in the early hours, demanding that they vacate the space that would shortly be used to shelter the wounded. Jack was forced to switch his mug of coffee to his left hand so that he could shake his commander's hand. You know what you are about? Yes. Jack sipped at the coffee, wincing at the bitter taste. He wanted to be away and put an end to the interminable waiting. Good. Keep close to Parma. Ballard felt the need to repeat the plan that he had outlined the night before. When the moment is right, you can change into your new uniforms. Find our man, stay at his side, then get him out of there as soon as you can. I don't care how you do it, just bring him to me here." Jack looked around him, making a mental map of the place he would need to find later that day. "What happens if you have to retreat?" "Then we shall stay close to McMahon's headquarters. Find that, and you will find us." Ballard's reply was clipped. Jack nodded. He saw Mary busy around the fire. "You'll keep Mary safe?" "I will." "Whatever happens?" "Of course." Ballard glanced across at Mary. "She is a fine woman." He looked back to meet Jack's gaze. "Whatever happens to you, she will be taken care of." Jack's eyes narrowed as he heard something change in Ballard's tone. But it was not the time to wonder at the goings-on in his master's mind. "What if we cannot get him out?" "You must. You have to find a way." Ballard scowled at the notion, then took a deep breath. "This boy is important to his family. Our sponsor needs him back. We cannot let him down." He fixed Jack with a hard stare. "And you have been well rewarded for your efforts. Or have you forgotten?" "No." Jack refused to let the memory of the burning gin palace into his mind. Ballard had taken him from the gutter, and had given both him and Mary a future. It had come at a price. That price was currently in the ranks of the French Foreign Legion. What if we don't get him away? Or if he's killed before we can get to him? He watched his commander closely as he asked the questions. "Then there is no need for you to return." "I see." Jack drained the last of his coffee. He understood well enough. Without Fleming, Jack had no name and no access to the money deposited in his real name. Mary and Billy's future would look as bleak as his own. He dug deep for a smile. "Do you always get what you want?" "Oh, yes." Ballard smiled at the notion. "I make sure of it." Jack was given no chance to reply. Behind Ballard's back he saw Palmer get into the saddle. The Major had been able to requisition 3 horses from McMahon's headquarters, 1 each for Jack and Palmer, and 1 for Fleming. Palmer beckoned to him. It was time to go. "I'll see you later, then." Jack tossed the dregs of his coffee to one side. Ballard did not answer. Mary came over to take his mug. He could see the concern on her face, her lips showing white as she pressed them tight together. "Look after my Billy." She cradled Jack's mug. "You bring him back safe." "It's a battlefield." Jack understood her pain, but he would not lie. "I cannot promise you that." Mary glanced at Ballard, who was watching a column of French infantry march along the road close to the aid station. "Yes, you bloody can." She hissed the words through gritted teeth. "And you will." Jack held her stare. He saw her fear. It was no small thing to let her child go with the 2 men, but someone needed to look after the horses when Jack and Palmer went to get Fleming. "He's a bright lad. He'll stay out of trouble." Jack would not tell her what she wanted to hear. He had already broken enough promises to blacken his soul for all eternity. He would not add to it by making another he could not be certain of keeping. "Mary." Ballard had turned back and now placed a hand on her shoulder. "William needs to do this. He is not going to fight. He will just look after the horses. Jack will see that he is left somewhere safe." "I will." Jack saw the interplay between the two. It was not like Ballard to touch anyone, let alone a woman. He wondered how much he had missed. "He had better." Mary allowed Ballard's hand to rest on her shoulder, but its presence did not lessen the emotion behind the glare that she sent Jack's way. "If he doesn't come back, then so help me, Jack, I will track you down and throttle you with my own bare hands." I hear you. Jack felt his anger starting to rise. He swallowed it with difficulty. It appeared half the damn world was making demands on him. Doing his best to ignore the twin stares he could feel boring into his spine, he went to find Palmer. Jack sat easily in the saddle, Billy's warm body pressed close against his back, the boy's arms clasped tight around his middle. They had 3 horses, but a childhood in the rookeries of East London was not one that gave the lad an opportunity to learn to ride. Palmer rode at his side, the 2 saddlebags containing the uniforms of the French Foreign Legion strapped behind him, and the lead rein of the spare horse held loosely in his left hand. Whether Fleming would ride it or would simply be draped across its saddle was yet to be discovered. The 2 men and 1 boy sat watching the French army prepare for the battle. Jack was impressed by what he saw, the troops going about their business without fuss. The long columns marched well, the ranks ordered and precise, the faces of the soldiers hardening as they made ready for what was to come. Other than the sound of an army on the move, all was peaceful. In India, it was called the Hawa Khana, the breathing of the air. The quiet moments before battle were a time for prayer and for ritual, for the final taking of a breath before the struggle to stay alive began. Jack was reminded of another dawn on another day. Then he had been at the fore, his place at the side of the commanding general dictating that he would be in the front ranks of the fighting. Now he would advance behind the attack, biding his time and waiting for the opportunity to strike. The army marched in darkness, shrouded in mist, the thud of boots hitting the ground the only sound disturbing the still air. Jack waited patiently for the men of the Legion to pass by. He did not bother to scan the massed ranks to see if he could locate Kearney or Fleming. There would be time enough to find them once the fighting began in earnest. Instead he looked to the east, searching for the first trace of dawn, and for the start of the day that would see many of those in the ranks marching past him left broken on the ground. "You do as I tell you, or so help me I'll tan your damn hide. You understand me?" "Yes, Jack." The boy's contempt for the unnecessary warning was obvious. "When will it start?" "Soon enough." "It better. I've had my fill of being pressed up against your sweaty arse." "What's your tongue?" Jack tried not to laugh. "You're not going to see any of it anyway." "That ain't fair." Jack twisted in the saddle so he could look at Billy's face. The boy was scowling. A battle isn't the place for a child. The scowl deepened. "I ain't a child." "You think you're a man?" "I think I could fight. There's boys my age with those Frenchies." Billy nodded towards the drummers buried in the heart of the column. "They don't fight." "They might." "No. They just shit in their breeches and run away." "You don't want me to see anything just so my ma don't scold you." "Maybe." Jack acknowledged the truth of the statement. "But you'll see plenty that you wish you hadn't. Believe me." "I'm bothered. I've seen bad things before, like when old George the Sweep had his belly slit open by that whore. Those guts of his were bright blue and he sat with them in his lap like they were that little dog Maggie had for a while. I don't care what you've seen. Your ma wants you out of the way, so that's where you'll be." Jack smiled at the lad's belligerence. The rookeries were a hard place, but they did not compare to the battlefield. Anything more he wanted to say was lost in the urgent sound of the first bugle of the day calling the column to a halt. The heavy drums followed, rattling into life. The lads had snatched away the covers that protected the instruments' skins from the damp morning air, and now brought their sticks down sharply, beating out the time that would provide the tempo as the column changed formation. The men knew what they were about. To the beat of the drum, the rear of the column marched outwards to form a line, the rearmost files walking the furthest to the extremities of the new formation. Jack pushed ahead as the Legion's frontage widened. Hold up, Jack. Palmer had stopped his mount and the one he still led, and now he called across to Jack as he saw the first enemy soldiers emerging from the mist-shrouded land ahead. You see him? Jack had been watching the Legion. Now he peered through the fog. He saw what Palmer meant immediately. My eye. He leaned to one side, letting the boy clinging to his waist have a clearer view. You see those, lad? Blow me tight. Jack laughed at Billy's reverential tone, the lad's bold claims forgotten the moment he clapped eyes on the enemy. For the Austrian army was not sitting back and waiting for the French to attack. Instead, it was advancing. Huge columns of infantry were marching towards the French army's right flank, each one made up of a whole battalion, and they were heading straight for the Legion. The French waited for the enemy. This would be no close-quarter battle like the cramped fight in the confined streets of Magenta. Rather, it would be a set-piece affair, with the Austrian conscripts packed tight in a series of columns aimed directly at the French line. The ground was made for such a battle. The Legion had deployed into a line at right angles to the road, facing south. The ridge of high ground anchored their left flank. In front of them was the great plain, the level terrain covered with wide fields of wheat. The Austrian infantry would have a fast and easy march as they headed northwards, with no obstacles in their way or rising ground to sap their strength. Those things are bloody big. Billy stared in awe at the enemy columns. You wait till they get close. Jack could not help but smile at the way the lad's eyes widened as the Austrians emerged from the early morning mist. But Billy's eyes narrowed again as he peered at the French line. 2 men deep, it looked fragile, stretched thin across the front of the enemy attack. They can't stop those bloody great things like that. He looked at Jack. Why are they just standing there? Jack offered a tight smile. That line doesn't look like much, I'll grant you, but it will stop them well enough. If they stand. He had seen columns before. He had known the fear as he had watched the seemingly relentless tide of humanity surging towards him, and he had seen them stopped, ranks gutted and torn, the thin line of British redcoats bludgeoning them to a halt with volley after volley of accurate rifle fire. Those buggers will march to the sound of their drums. Jack smiled as he spoke softly to the lad clutching around his middle. They'll keep coming, and that noise why it won't ever stop. The columns came on, steady and calm. Drums deep in their midst beat out the tempo of the advance, the mesmeric, hypnotic rhythm driving the white-coated Austrian infantry forward through the great fields of wheat still wet from the morning dew. Then they'll cheer. They'll cheer so loud that you'll feel it deep down in your belly. Jack warmed to his tale. He saw the boy hanging on his every word, his eyes riveted on Jack's mouth as he foretold what was to come. Their officers will lead them on, waving their swords over their heads and shouting at the lads in the ranks. They'll goad them, daring them to kill every last one of us. Closer and closer they'll come, those drums beating all the while. They'll seem unstoppable then. It'll look like there are so many of the buggers that it won't be possible to kill enough to make a difference. The French line settled, then began to load their rifles, the commands of their officers and sergeants rippling up and down the companies as they prepared to make their stand against the massive columns. Jack smiled. And then, that fragile line will open fire, and it'll all be over in a couple of minutes. How so? Billy scoffed at his words. How can that, he pointed at the Legion, stop those? He waved at the Austrian columns moving purposefully towards them. Did your ma teach you to add up? Of course. Then do it now. How many rifles are in that line? Billy twisted in the saddle as he looked at the French soldiers. A lot. How many men in those columns can return fire. Billy screwed up his eyes as he peered through the mist. Just those in the front. So, who wins? Billy's lips moved as he did the calculations. Every man in the French line could fire, whereas only the Austrians in the front 2 ranks of each column could hope to return it. He did the sums, and for the first time in a while, he smiled. What do you do? It's simple, isn't it? Jack nodded as the boy reached the correct conclusion. Those columns look bloody frightening, I'll give you that. But when they're close enough, our boys over there will open fire. The first volley will cut down the front ranks, maybe the second, and perhaps even the third. The white coats will still come on, even if they have to tread their mates into the dirt to do it. But then, the second volley will hit them. The front of that column will be like a bloody butcher's yard. They'll be screaming then. Those whose arms have been torn off or whose guts are spilling into their hands, they'll get in the way, stopping their mates coming up behind. The French, well, they'll keep firing. Keep killing and maiming. And they won't be able to miss, will they? Seeing as how those bloody things are so damn big. Jack tasted something bitter as he predicted what was to come. If those Austrian boys have any sense, they'll turn tail right here and now. If they're brave, or foolish, he shook his head, or both, then they'll still try to come on. But they won't stand, not for long. When they break, there'll be nothing more than a mob of frightened bastards running for their lives. He looked at Billy, his smile stretched thin. So, don't be frightened. Those poor buggers are marching to their deaths. Chapter 33. The Austrian columns came on in fine style. The noise assaulted the French line, the bugle calls and the beat of the drums getting ever louder. The advance of the great blocks of men seemed inexorable, the French line far too fragile to stand against such power. The Austrian conscripts saw it too. They cheered with every step, whilst their officers bellowed encouragement. The great yellow and black flags waved at the columns' heads, the proud imperial eagles revealed to the men packed tight in the ranks as the breeze caught the huge squares of silk. Jack watched, grim-faced, as the men of the Legion finished loading their Minié rifles. It was the same weapon he had used in the Crimea, a fine gun for an infantryman. The barrel was rifled, the long grooves etched into the inside, spinning the bullet to make it vastly more accurate than the smooth-bore muskets it had replaced. But it was not the rifling that made the Minié one of the most deadly weapons ever used on the battlefield. The real genius was in the bullet. Unlike the round balls fired by the rifles used when the first Napoleon was emperor, the conical bullet fired by the Minié was smaller than the weapon's barrel, allowing the men to load quickly and easily. When the charge was ignited, the base of the bullet deformed and expanded to grip the rifling. This expansion also contained the power of the charge's detonation, ensuring that all of it was delivered behind the bullet. It was dreadfully effective. In the Crimea, Jack had seen 5 or even 6 men hit by a single bullet. Now he looked at the advancing columns and felt something close to sympathy for the Austrians approaching the French line. He had no doubt what would happen, what fate awaited the men packed together in the tightly spaced ranks. He knew what was to come, and he felt angry. For the Austrian commanders had learned nothing of the wars already fought in the era of modern weaponry. The French general would still take no chances. He saw the might of the columns, and he sent his artillery to support his infantry. Jack watched as the French artillerymen bustled around their guns, the air filled with the shouts of their officers and sergeants as they prepared to fire. The men knew what they were about, and it did not take long for the teams of horses to be sent to the rear, the guns lined up so that their great, gaping muzzles pointed towards the enemy. The columns were getting closer. The white-coated ranks advanced with discipline, the formation maintaining its cohesion even as they came into range of the French gunners. With a great roar, the guns opened fire. Jack felt Billy flinch as the thunderclap of sound pounded into them. "Watch, boy, watch!" He snapped the instruction, his own eyes fixed on the columns. Soil and dust was thrown up in great fountains of dirt as the first shells smashed into the ground just ahead of the closest column. The French gunners were firing at what seemed to Jack to be an impossibly long range, but they had still nearly found their mark with their first volley. The gunners did not pause to celebrate. The gun line was a hive of activity as the artillerymen went through the tightly choreographed routine of reloading. The second volley seared out across the plain less than half a minute later. This time the barrels were warmer and the shells went further, tearing into the Austrian columns. Even from a distance, Jack saw great gaps ripped in the enemy's ranks before a thin cloud of powder smoke obscured his view. The familiar stink stuck in his throat, the rotten egg stench filling his mouth. He leaned from the saddle and spat, the taste bitter. When his head lifted, the powder smoke had rolled away enough for him to see a battery of Austrian guns deploying to return fire. From so far away, the enemy gunners looked tiny, swarming around their cannon like so many ants disturbed from a nest. The French fired 2 more volleys before the enemy gunners were ready to reply. Jack saw great gouts of flame sear from the Austrian cannon as they replied, the sound very different to the great roars of the French salvos. He tried to trace the path of the shot, but the range was simply too great, and all he saw was a series of crevices being gouged in the ground well to the front of the French line. The French gunners did not pause. They poured on their volleys, their rifled barrels so much more effective than the smoothbore cannon used by the Austrians. Shell after shell hit the infantry columns, each one tearing another great gash in the ranks. Jesus Christ! Jack had never seen an artillery barrage like it. The French gunners were destroying the Austrian columns. Barely a shell was missing even at such long range, and already the advance was grinding to a bloody halt. A battery of Austrian horse artillery rushed forward. It was a courageous move. Jack could see the gunners lashing at their horses to drive them on. The limbers scrambled across the ground, the cannons behind buckling like wild creatures. The Austrian artillerymen were gambling on a fast advance to allow them to close the range and bring their cannon to bear on the French guns that were wreaking such havoc on their comrades. Jack heard the shouts from the French gun line as the enemy horse artillery was spotted. It took little time to turn a battery of the French guns towards them, the gunners hallooing joyously like a hunter getting his first glimpse of a fox. Still, the Austrian horse artillery came on, flaunting their courage. The men in the columns cheered them loudly, even as another salvo of shells ripped into their ranks. The French battery finished realigning and opened fire. Their gun sergeants had taken their time aiming, their skill challenged by the bravery of their peers in the enemy ranks. Jack tried to gauge the range. It had to be at least 1,000 yards, much too far for a smoothbore cannon to hope to hit its target, but well within the range of these new French guns that had been manufactured and designed for just such a moment as this. The French salvo hit. Not one shell missed. One moment the Austrian guns had been galloping forward, the next they were destroyed. A lone gun emerged from the destruction. 5 had been hit and now lay smoking in ruin, the ground around them smothered with dead horses and broken men. The single gun to survive swerved around and charged for the rear. The cheers of the Austrian infantry died away. Jack turned his gaze from the slaughter. It was a dreadful demonstration of the power of the modern cannon. Warfare was changing in front of his eyes. To the left of the French line, the ridge was wreathed in smoke. Maréchal MacMahon's Second Corps was just one of the 5 French infantry divisions at the Emperor's disposal that day. Whilst Jack was witnessing the fight on the southern flank of the battlefield, other French divisions were assaulting the ridge itself. From where he sat, it was impossible to know if those assaults were succeeding or if they were being destroyed as easily as the Austrian columns. "Those are brave boys." Palmer voiced his opinion softly, drawing Jack's attention back to the great blocks of infantry that were still struggling forward. It was indeed a courageous display, the men in white uniforms forced to pick their way over the dead and the dying, the ground behind them littered with broken bodies. The French guns fired without pause. Every shell hit, every shell killed. The columns were nowhere near the French line when the inevitable happened. With hundreds slaughtered, the survivors could advance no further. The formations broke, the men turning and streaming towards the rear in sudden, desperate haste. The French gunners kept firing, killing and maiming even as their enemy ran. The men in the French line did not cheer. The Legionnaires had watched fellow infantrymen butchered by the artillery fire, and more than one face turned to stare in loathing at the gunners, the foot soldiers' sympathy firmly with the men in the white uniforms. The guns fell silent, the broken enemy ranks now too far away even for the power of their precious new cannon. The first Austrian attack had been repulsed without the French infantry firing a single volley. Jack shifted his aching buttocks as he sat on the ground. He looked around, trying to see if anything was happening, but he could see nothing save for French troops standing patiently in their ranks as they waited for fresh orders. He could hear the sounds of fighting, but they came from far away on the ridge and were not close enough to warrant his attention. "Gonna be a storm." Palmer was sitting on the ground next to Jack, whilst Billy held all 3 horses. He was looking up at the sky. The day was already hot, the air muggy and close. The skies overhead were grey and smudged with an inky darkness, the telltale signs of a storm building over the top of the battlefield. The Legion had not moved for several hours, the morning dragging by with excruciating slowness. There had been some activity. Austrian cavalry had threatened Second Corps' right flank, the hostile detachments probing the joint between it and Third Corps. MacMahon's cavalry had seen them off easily enough. The fighting had been too far away for the men in the Legion to see very much of it at all, and Jack was feeling thoroughly bored. "Looks like it," he agreed. He looked across at his comrade. "I've never seen columns beaten back like that." He'd been dwelling on the fate of the Austrian infantry. "No." Palmer's expression was as dark as the sky. "Those poor boys didn't stand a chance." Jack denied any notion of sympathy. "At least it was over quickly." "Hark at you! You don't know shit, Jack." Billy was standing close enough to overhear, and he interrupted with laughter. "It was nothing like you said it would be." Jack ignored the comment, but the boy was correct. He had seen war, had fought in enough battles to know what to expect, but his experience bore little comparison to what they had just witnessed. War was changing. The men far away in the factories designing and manufacturing weapons that made a mockery of the tactics used on every battlefield since the previous century. "Here we go." Palmer spotted the arrival of a galloper, a young officer in sky blue who rode fast along the line towards a group of officers. As he came closer, they turned as one to face him. "At last. I reckon we'll go north." Jack glared at Billy, who pulled a face as he heard a fresh prediction. "That way." He nodded towards the ridge. "I reckon you're right." Palmer stood up to get a clearer view. He sat down quickly enough, shaking his head. "I can't see fuck all." Jack grunted in acknowledgement. It was always the way. Once the battle started, a soldier could only see what was going on around him, and even then it was hard to know anything more than what was happening right under his nose. No one knew the whole picture, not even the general commanding the army. It was only afterwards that some overall sense of events could be gleaned. During the day, all a man could do was beat the enemy in front of him and pray to God that everyone else was doing the same. A series of bugle calls followed within a minute of the gallopers' arrival. Almost immediately the long line of infantrymen started to break up, returning to the column formation that was more suitable for manoeuvres, reforming to face northwards towards the ridge that dominated the centre of the battlefield. Ahead of them was San Cassiano, the village spread across the slope of the ridge to the south of Solferino. Thus far the men of the Legion had been spectators, their role in the battle limited to standing by and watching as the Austrian columns were destroyed. But the day was young, and now it would be their turn to go on the offensive. Chapter 34. Jack guessed that it was early afternoon when the French columns marched for a second time. The officers took their time. The columns had no sooner moved off when they were stopped again, the sergeants and corporals running around the ranks to ensure that every file was perfectly spaced and every rank aligned with those around it, so that the column was ordered and formed correctly. Only when they were satisfied did the men move off again, the drums beating out the rhythm of the advance. Jack, Billy and Palmer followed the rear ranks of the Legion. They rode easily, their borrowed horses taking the strain as the ground sloped up sharply once they reached the lower reaches of the ridge. Now the column stopped again. This time it was to redeploy. With the drums beating out the time, the men moved into a new formation. In the days of the First Napoleon, the French army had attacked in great columns. A dozen or more battalions formed into one massive body of men. Reform had been slow, but defeat at the hands of the British and their European allies had taught the French that such tactics needed to be consigned to the past. Now the Legion redeployed into mixed order. There were 8 battalions committed to the attack on San Cassiano. They were ordered into 2 groups of 4. In each formation, 2 battalions would form line, the men arranged in 2 long ranks, one battalion beside the other. The other 2 battalions would advance in a battalion column, one on each flank of the line. The formation was designed to lessen the effect of enemy artillery fire whilst having the firepower of a line, but with flanks secured by the denser columns. The Legion would form the right-hand column on the southernmost formation. Each of the battalion's 8 companies moved into a 2-man deep line arranged one behind the other. Once in place, the men fixed their bayonets, the air filled with purposeful clicks as they twisted the steel blades into place. With the French assault paused, Jack had time to pull his field glasses from their leather pouch and use them to see what lay ahead. It did not take long to bring the slopes around San Cassiano into sight. The ground the French were attacking was smothered with white-coated Austrian infantry formed into long lines on the slope below the village. It would be a hard fight. The French battalions would have to advance against the Austrian line with the slope sapping their strength. They would be under fire every step of the way, the Austrian line able to pour down volley after volley. The ridge was a strong defensive position, and this time the Austrian line held all the advantages. "This is close enough." Jack twisted in the saddle so he could face Billy. "Down you get, lad." The boy needed no further urging. Jack felt the cold breeze on his back as Billy's warm body slipped from the saddle to land sure-footed on the ground. Jack dismounted too, immediately handing the reins to Billy. Palmer had already done the same and now tossed a sack in Jack's direction. Jack slipped his worsted jacket from his shoulders. He dipped into the sack and pulled out the blue tunic of the Legion. It was time to lose the civilian garb and become a soldier once again. Stay here and don't bloody move. We'll need to come and find you, and we can only do that if we know where you are." Billy nodded earnestly in reply to Jack's instructions. They stood in a sparse copse of cypress trees. It would offer little in the way of shelter, but it was a decent landmark, one Jack was reasonably sure he could find again with no trouble. He did not know how the day would play out, but if Ballard's plan went off perfectly, he and Palmer would be back soon enough, the errant son reclaimed. "He'll be all right." Palmer walked over with an oddly stiff gait. His Legionnaire's tunic was too tight and pulled badly across his shoulders. Jack smiled at the effect. "You look about as French as boiled beef and carrots." Palmer chuckled at the comment. "I don't plan to wear this get-up for long." He nodded at Jack. "At least yours fits." Jack made a show of preening. "I quite like it." He had worn both the bright scarlet of a British officer and the plain red wool of an ordinary soldier. He had worn the dark blue of a British hussar, the dusty khaki jacket of an Indian irregular, and even the fabulous sky-blue tunic of a Maharaja's general. The Legionnaire's blue coat was just another to add to the list. He settled the kepi on his head. Ballard had done well to find them uniforms. The battle to come would be quite unlike the confused, close-quarter fighting in Magenta that had allowed them to find Fleming without being turned away. This time it would be hard, if not impossible, to get close to him, the Legion sure to fight in a tight, organised formation. Ballard's stolen uniform gave them a chance of getting amongst the ranks, a chance they would need to take if they were to have any hope of completing their mission. Jack turned to jab a finger against Billy's chest. "Repeat your orders." "Stay here." The boy bit his lip. It was no small thing to be left alone on a battlefield. "Until you come back." "Good lad." He bent down to retrieve his discarded clothing, then shoved it into the hemp sack. He paused as he picked up his revolver. He was tempted to buckle the weapon around his waist. He hefted it in one hand, then looked at Billy. "Here." He held the revolver by the barrel and offered it to the boy. "Take it." Billy took the gun and looked at it with wide eyes. "You know how to use it?" Jack was watching him carefully as he handed over the revolver's cartridge pouch. "You remember everything I taught you?" "Of course." "Only use it if you have to. If you do something bottle-head stupid with it, I'll give you a hiding the likes of which you have never seen. Is that clear?" "Yes, Jack." Billy was busy stuffing the pouch into his pockets. "You hear me?" Jack injected more force into his voice. Billy slid the revolver into the waistband of his trousers, then looked at him with solemn eyes. "Yes, Jack." "Good." Jack jabbed the lad with his finger. "And don't let anyone take the bloody horses." "I won't." The boy's chin lifted in defiance. "Good lad." Palmer reached across to ruffle Billy's hair before turning back to make sure that all three horses were safely tethered to a couple of sturdy trees. Satisfied, he unbuckled a pair of Minié rifles that he had tied to his saddle, handing one to Jack. "You know how to use a bundook?" Jack took the rifle with a tight-lipped smile. He had left his sabre in its scabbard tied to the saddle of his horse, and now Billy had his revolver. But he would not go onto the field of battle unarmed. The rifle's weight was both reassuring and familiar. It had been many years since he had carried a long arm into battle, but he knew that the drills he would need to use it were buried deep inside. Palmer handed over a black leather belly pouch full of cartridges, followed by a cap box that Jack could wear around his waist. Jack took his time with the new equipment, making sure that both items sat snugly against his body. Only when he was happy did he reach over to take the final item that Palmer had brought for them both. The bayonet was heavy, Jack held the weight for a moment, his fingers lingering on the steel blade, the metal cool to his touch. He could feel the sheen of oil under his fingertips, its stink just as he remembered. With a purposeful action, he slotted the bayonet into the end of the rifle's barrel before giving it a firm twist to lock it in place. Palmer nodded in approval. He offered a half smile. "Shall we go?" Jack nodded. It was time to find Fleming. It felt odd being on his feet after riding all morning. The heat was getting oppressive, and Jack was sweating freely. They were walking fast, closing the distance between them and the column of Legionnaires, which was already a fair way ahead. Neither of them had said a word since they had left Billy and the horses. Jack needed his breath for marching, the steep slope already pulling at his calf muscles. But he still had enough strength to turn as they pressed on, the rising ground presenting him with a good view over the ground to the south and the east. It was easy enough to spot the place where the Austrian columns had been turned. The ground was churned up and scarred. Hundreds of bodies lay where they had fallen, and he was glad to be far enough away to be spared the details. Further to the south, he could just about make out a number of other French troops holding their ground. From their numbers, he supposed he was looking at the best part of a whole corps. A wide band of cavalry protected the joint between the men attacking the ridge and those still on the plain. The horsemen would cover both divisions' flanks, their presence enough to prevent any Austrian attack from severing the link between them. The pace of the French drums increased. The Legion was moving briskly, its commanders eager to see it close on the Austrians holding the slopes around San Cassiano. No one turned to shout at the pair of straggling Legionnaires running after the column. Jack's breath was rasping in his throat by the time they reached the Legion's rearmost company. He felt as if his face was on fire. His palms were slick, and when he lifted one from his rifle, he saw the sweaty imprint left behind. The drummers picked up the pace yet again. Now they sounded the pas de charge, the rhythm that had propelled the French army into the attack since the days of the First Napoleon. The Legionnaires greeted the change in tempo with a great roar. It was a feral sound, a snarl of anger and fear released. The column surged forward, the beat propelling them on. Jack and Palmer went with it, their legs pumping hard as the slope steepened beneath their boots. Jack could no longer see the enemy line that waited ahead, but he could imagine it. The Austrian infantry would be standing in a line 3 men deep, the front 2 ranks ready to fire, the third ready to step forward to take the place of any that fell. Their skirmishers would be running forward, whilst the officers and sergeants stationed on the flanks and behind the line would be shouting themselves hoarse as they readied their men to fire their first volley. He flinched as a battery of enemy artillery opened fire. The roar of their volley echoed over the heads of the Legion in the moments before the first round shot ploughed into their ranks. The Austrian cannon might be old-fashioned, but the solid iron shot still cut a swathe of death through the neatly ordered ranks. The Legion pressed on, the damaged ranks closing up, the sergeants in charge of the broken files shouting at their charges to keep going. Another volley of round shots smashed into the column with appalling force. Men were punched to the ground, their bodies shattered. Their mates could do nothing but march on, the dead and dying ignored. Jack stepped around the first body he saw. A young Legionnaire lay face up, his sightless, staring eyes betraying the shock and surprise of being hit, his left arm, shoulder, and much of his side ripped away by a fast-moving round-shot. The bitter taste of fear was on Jack's tongue. He had stood and watched as the Austrian columns were gutted by artillery fire. Now the Legion faced the same fate, and he was no longer a dispassionate observer. This time he marched in the ranks, being targeted by the enemy's guns. This time it could be his body left broken and torn for others to trip over. This time he could die. Something roared past overhead. Another similar object followed almost instantly, followed by yet another. Each cut through the air with a strange fizzing sound, a long trail of smoke surging out behind. "Rockets!" Palmer had to bellow to be heard. "Shit!" Jack could not help ducking as one of the devilish missiles seared by just above his head. It ploughed into the company ahead, exploding on impact, cutting 2 men in half and showering the rest with red-hot shards of steel. 6 men fell as the shrapnel tore into them, a great hole blown in the files. "Fucking hell!" Jack lowered his head. He did not look at the ruined flesh that passed by his boots. The remains of the men hit by the rocket now scattered wantonly across the blackened grass. The sound of muskets firing came in between each volley of artillery. He knew that the skirmishers from both sides would be in the fight now, the light troops picking at one another to keep their opposite numbers at bay. It was a bitter fight fought in the dead ground in front of the Austrian line. It would not decide who won, but men still died lest the other side find an advantage. He sucked down another lungful of scorching air. The Legionnaires advanced steadily, ignoring the gaps blown in their ranks. Officers shouted encouragement, whilst sergeants screamed threats. The beat of the drums was unfaltering and constant, the padachage goading the ranks into the attack, no matter how many of the young drummer boys were slain. They were close to the Austrian line now. The air was full of the dreadful cacophony of battles. Explosions and screams, the roar of cannon and the crackle of musketry. They marched as if into a storm, hunched and bowed. Jack went with them, his senses battered by the tempest. The main Austrian line fired their opening volley. The air was filled with a dreadful storm of musket balls that cut into the leading ranks of the column, scything men down by the dozen. For a moment the Legion shuddered as it absorbed the dreadful punishment. Then it lurched back into motion, the damage it had taken shrugged off as if it meant nothing. The officers still led the way, swords waving as they exhorted their men to follow. Jack could only marvel at their bravery. Many died, their bright epaulets and golden buttons marking them out as targets for the enemy infantry, but enough stayed standing, and they ran at the Austrian line, setting the example the battered ranks needed. With a great roar, the Legion stormed forward, following their officers as they charged at the enemy. Jack went with them, forcing his way deep into the ranks, his eyes scanning the faces around him for the man he sought. He could see nothing of the other battalions in the attack. His world reduced to little more than the men around him. The Austrian line fired a second volley. Dozens of legionnaires were cut down, but the men were past caring and they swept past the broken bodies without pause. Jack shouted as he went with them. He felt nothing as his boot slipped on a man's spilt guts, his only thought not to lose his footing. To his front, an officer died, his face smothered in blood. He fell away, a legionnaire shoving his body to one side without mercy. The Legion had taken its casualties. It had advanced no matter how many of its men had fallen. Now they charged, bayonets at the ready. It was time to exact a bloody revenge. Chapter 35. Jack bellowed his war cry as the Legion charged. Around him the ordered ranks were breaking up. These were the hard yards, the bloody yards, when there was nothing to be done save to keep going forward, no matter what horror was inflicted upon those around him. Time was slowing, each moment taking an age. The ground passed under his boots with stubborn slowness, every step an effort of will. He glimpsed the Austrian line. He was close enough to see the look of horror on the faces of the young conscripts ordered to face the charging legionnaires. As he watched, he saw them lift their muskets to their shoulders. He could not hold back another cry as a tongue of fire leapt from every muzzle. The air around him snapped and crackled, musket balls zipping past close enough for him to feel the air shake. The cry turned into a cheer as he realized he was still whole. The legionnaires ignored their casualties and surged forward. They were close enough to know that the Austrians had no time to reload. Time accelerated to pass at breakneck speed, the last yards flying by in a blur. Jack spotted a blonde-haired legionnaire to his left. He angled his run, sliding past another soldier, then following the man he had sought even as he charged at the Austrian line. The legionnaires hit the enemy at full tilt. They had taken heavy casualties, but these were men who had been hardened on the battlefields of the Crimea and North Africa. They tore into the Austrians like a whirlwind. Their sergeants led the way. With so many officers gone, it was down to the non-commissioned officers to show their men what was expected. Now the most experienced soldiers fought their way into the enemy line, their bayonets thrusting at the men standing against them. The legionnaires followed, keening for blood. The Austrians held their ground. They might not be veteran soldiers, but they understood pride. Their own bayonets rammed forward. Many legionnaires died at the point of the charge. The Austrian conscripts had been well drilled, and they fought with the relentless purpose of automatons. Time and time again their bayonets found their way into a legionnaire's flesh, the advantage of the higher ground making their grim task all the easier. Yet the French soldiers would not quit, the despairing cries of the fallen goading their comrades on. All along the line they gouged gaps in the Austrian formation. Wherever a white-coated defender fell, 2 or more legionnaires threw themselves into the breach. The line was slowly ripped apart, the French bayonets exacting a dreadful toll on the enemy ranks. Jack saw Fleming enter the fray. To his front, the enemy line was still whole, and 3 legionnaires died almost at the same instant as Austrian bayonets cut them down. Fleming threw himself into the gap. Jack saw him batter aside a bayonet aimed at his stomach, then thrust his own weapon forward, an animal snarl of anger exploding from his lips. Jack pounded up the slope, forcing his way through the men in front of him. The pain in his lungs and in his legs disappeared as he followed Fleming into the Austrian line. An Austrian conscript screamed as he lunged with his bayonet. Jack spotted the blow coming. He battered it to one side with the rifle of his barrel. He saw his foe's eyes widen in sudden fear before he slammed the rifle's butt into the man's face. "Come on!" He bellowed his challenge as he stepped forward, keeping close to Fleming. He had lost sight of Palmer, but there was no time to wonder if his comrade had survived the bloody advance. More legionnaires pressed around him. They went forward in a wedge, each man trying to protect the others. Fleming led the way. He fought hard at the point of the wedge, leading his comrades deeper into the enemy formation, his bayonet already bloodied to the hilt. An Austrian officer came at Fleming from the side, his curved sword slashing at the legionnaire's face. Jack saw the danger, so raised his rifle, knocking the sword away. The Austrian snarled and turned on Jack, lunging again, his sword cutting a thick splinter from the barrel of Jack's rifle. Another attack followed, then another, the officer shouting incoherently with every blow. Jack saw the man's lips pull back into a grimace as he came at him again. The Austrian was young, but he was quick and used his sword well. Jack staggered as he only just blocked a thrust aimed at his groin. The man recovered fast, leaving him no time to counter, and lifted his sword before darting forward in a swipe at Jack's throat. Jack lowered his rifle and swayed back. The blade rasped by, close enough for him to feel the wind of its passing. It went wide, and he roared as he lunged his bayonet into the soft flesh beneath the Austrian's chin. The officer tried to scream, but Jack twisted the bayonet, tearing the gristle of the man's throat wide open so that blood gushed from the horrible wound, smothering the cry before it could be formed. He pushed hard, forcing the body backwards and off his bayonet. He felt nothing as the Austrian officer fell away, his sabre dropping from his grasp. Jack looked around. The Austrian line had stood firm, the conscripts in its ranks fighting long after other, more experienced men would have run. But against the veteran legionnaires they could not hold forever, and now they broke. Jack sucked in huge draughts of air. Each breath scorched his lungs, the air heated as if from an oven, but he pulled it down nonetheless until he could breathe almost normally. The legionnaires around him were doing the same. Each face mirrored the same expression of relief and exhaustion. He looked back the way the column had come. The ground was littered with bodies. Some lay in groups, half a dozen bundled together, twisted into a single grotesque shape. Others were alone, serene and peaceful as they stared at the sky through sightless eyes. Everywhere the ground was torn and blackened, the pits and rents from exploding shells scarring the landscape. He saw artillery advancing up the slope, the French commander seeking to consolidate the position the legionnaires had paid for with their blood. The slope was too steep for the gunners' horse trains, and so it was down to the strength of the men in the regiments held in reserve to drag the guns into position. Whilst lines of men hauled the cannons up, others stood in long chain gangs, passing up ammunition from the caissons left at the foot of the slope. With his body recovering, Jack picked up his rifle and walked towards the man he had come so far to find. Fleming was squatting next to a legionnaire stretched out on the ground. His eyes lifted as he saw Jack approach. For a moment there was the flash of recognition, then he turned his attention back to his fallen comrade, his lips moving as he offered comfort to the dying man. "Do nothing foolish." Jack turned at the sudden command. Carney had come up behind him. The Legionnaire sergeant looked like he had just returned from a day working in the slaughterhouse. His blue uniform was covered with dark stains, his sleeves bloodied to the elbow. Drops of blood speckled his face like engorged freckles, and 5 streaks of red lined one cheek from where an enemy soldier must have clawed at his face. His bayonet was dripping blood, and it was pointed at Jack's heart. "Leave him be." Another voice made itself known. Jack saw Palmer coming towards him. His uniform was just as grim, and a great tear had been ripped down one side. It was a relief to see the large man still standing, especially as he now approached Carney with his rifle held ready to strike. Carney glanced over his shoulder at Palmer. If he felt any emotion at the threat, he did not show it. He looked at Jack. "I saw you fight." Jack kept his eyes on the bayonet aimed at his heart. The blood was already blackening and congealing. It would not stop the blade if Carney chose to drive it forward. "You're good." The sergeant gave the praise with a trace of a smile. "You've done this before." "Once or twice." Eyes still on Jack, Carney lowered his rifle. "You cannot take him away. Not yet. I still need him. He turned to glance at Palmer. Drop your weapon, my friend. There'll be enough killing today without you adding to it here. Palmer grunted, but he did as the Legionnaire sergeant said. He walked easily to Jack's side, the rifle held casually in one hand. Where's our man? Jack nodded towards Fleming, who had not yet moved. He still crouched next to his dying comrade, his hand on the man's shoulder. You two are persistent. Carney stood between them. Will you ever give up? No. Palmer said the single word, then turned to spit out a wad of phlegm. Like it or not, that little shit is coming with us. Carney smiled at the bold claim. You must want him badly. Not us. It's my master that wants him back. Palmer wiped a hand across his face. He wants us to take the dolt back to his father. You will return him to his family? Carney asked the question quietly. That's the plan, Palmer answered. Carney nodded slowly. I have your word. Palmer scowled. I said it, didn't I? Then you can take him. Carney looked at them both in turn. After the battle. He can meet with this master of yours, but I need him until it's over. Jack considered the notion. He might die. Carney shrugged. So, keep him safe. From what I saw, you both know what you're doing. And you appear to be wearing our uniform, so stay. Fight with us. Keep him safe, and then you can go. All three of you. Jack looked at Palmer. The larger man's expression was unreadable. What if we say no? What if we take him now? Carney laughed at the notion. Look around you. Jack did as he suggested. A dozen or more faces were staring at him, each sharing the same calm look. Enough had understood the conversation. Those who had not were being given a rapid translation, the men of Carney's company all aware of the deal their sergeant was striking with the two impostors dressed as legionnaires. He had no doubt that these men would kill him at a single word from Carney. His would be one more body amidst the hundreds, the thousands that already littered the ground. The battlefield was the perfect place for a quiet murder, for who would notice one more on a day of 10,000? Carney smiled as he saw understanding appear in Jack's expression. He stepped forward and clapped a hand on the Englishman's shoulder. I need more men. We've lost too many taking this damn hill. Stay and fight with us. If you live, you can take Fleming to your master. If you die... He left the last part of the sentence unsaid. Fleming stood up. His comrade on the ground was dead. He saw Jack and Palmer standing with Carney. For a moment it looked like he would come to join them. Instead he hefted his rifle in his hand and went to rejoin his mates. Decide, quickly now. Carney had spotted movement amongst the legionnaires. Two young officers were striding along the ranks, bellowing fresh orders at the men who had won them the high ground. Carney cocked an ear, then gestured to his men. En place! The legionnaires sitting on the ground responded immediately, lumbering to their feet and shuffling towards the line that was being formed across the crest of the ridge facing east. What's it to be? Carney snapped the question at the two Englishmen. Jack looked at Palmer, then shrugged his shoulders. There was no choice. If they were to obey Ballard and keep Fleming safe, they had to stay close at his side. That meant going wherever he went. For better or worse, the Legion had two new recruits. Chapter 36. Mary stood outside the aid post and fretted. She stared into the distance, trying to make sense of the noises that echoed towards her. The rattle of rifle fire underscored the constant boom of artillery. At times the din was relentless, the sounds blending together like a concerto in full flow. Then it would quieten down, the deep bass blasts of the cannons coming alone before the sound of rifle fire returned, sometimes in single shots, at other times in long bursts that sounded like a child running a wooden rod along a fence. She was mesmerized by it all. She wondered if Billy was hearing the same noises. Did they frighten him, or did the roar of battle excite him? For the umpteenth time she regretted letting him go with Ballard's men. She cared nothing for their great quest. The fate of one man meant nothing against the safety of her own son. "He will be fine." Ballard had approached silently, and now he spoke softly, interrupting her thoughts. "How can you say that?" Mary spat out the reply. Ballard's eyes narrowed. "I trust Palmer. Jack, too, I suppose. I'm certain they will not allow anything to happen to your boy." "Then you're a fool." Mary crossed her arms. "No man could promise something like that. Listen, you hear that? Think those two clots can do anything against that?" "No." Ballard bowed his head as he made the admission softly. His fingers lifted to toy with his moustache. "I should not have ordered him to go." "It's too late for that," Mary sighed. "We just have to pray that he comes back." "I understand." Ballard's hand moved as if to touch her shoulder, but he hesitated so that it was held awkwardly in midair. "I know what it is to fear for a child." Mary looked at him sharply. "You have a child?" Ballard nodded, his lips pressed together. "A boy. I let him down rather badly. I was not the father I should have been." "Few men are." "Perhaps." He offered a tight-lipped smile. "Perhaps I have time to rectify it, to make amends." "Well, that would be very nice." Mary's reply was caustic. "You don't believe me?" Mary considered the notion. "Maybe you will." "Jack told me you always get what you want." "Did he now?" Ballard chuckled. "I confess I do not understand that man, but I do respect him. He's a good man to have on one's side, especially in a place such as this." "Jack is a fool. He believes he can make a difference." Mary shook her head. "He's a good man, I suppose, but he's driven by his demons. He won't ever be happy, won't ever make a home. He'll just keep wandering. Oh, he does what he thinks is best, I'll give him that. But when things get hard, he walks away, leaves others to deal with the mess he creates. Yet you rely on him for your future." Mary scowled. "He took my future away from me. If he hadn't come back, I'd still be working in the ginny and my son would not be on some godforsaken battlefield." "So, he owes you?" "Damn right he does." "And you trust him to deliver?" Mary's scowl deepened. "I don't have much of a choice." Ballard's mouth formed to make a reply, but stopped. He looked at Mary, then at his boots. "You do have a choice. At least I would like to think that there is another option for you to consider." "And what's that?" Mary had looked away. She was staring towards the front, The rate of cannon fire had increased. She could feel the ground shaking, the very earth beneath her feet trembling as it too heard the sound of battle and was afraid. Me. Ballard spoke gently, the word barely audible over the din of distant fighting. You? Mary could not hold back the exclamation. I have come to admire you. Ballard winced as he spoke, as if the words were being dragged painfully from the very depths of his being. I would like you to stay with me. You want me to work for you? Mary stalled for time. She had tried not to think of her future, but relying on Jack alone to fend for her and her son was not an attractive option. She knew he would not stay with them, at least not for long. He would claim that he would not shirk his duty towards her, but she knew him too well to believe him. Ballard cleared his throat. No, I was thinking of an alternative situation. Well, what then? I would like you at my side. I would like to ask you to marry me. Mary was struck dumb. Of course you would not consider such a notion. Ballard quickly filled the silence. It was a foolish idea. I should not have mentioned it. No. Mary reached out to hush him by laying her hand on his arm. She smiled as she saw the way his expression changed as she touched him. It's not foolish, it's generous and kind, and I'm honoured you would think of me in that way. She laughed then. The idea that she could wed a respectable gentleman like Ballard striking her as the queerest thing she had ever heard. She was a backstreet whore with a bastard child, not some princess in a fairy tale. Ballard misunderstood her laughter. His face coloured and he pulled away. I am sorry that you find my suggestion ridiculous. He puffed up with precious dignity. It's not that. Mary swatted his arm, then composed herself. It's a lovely offer, really. She sighed. But I cannot accept it. At least, not for now. Not with this going on, not with my boy out there. She offered a smile. Let's get through the day, shall we? Then we can think on the future. Of course. Ballard was quick to seize on her suggestion of a delay. It was thoughtless of me to bring the matter up at this juncture. He paused. But will you consider it? I will, Mary replied seriously. But for now I think we should get to work. She looked past Ballard's shoulder. A commissary cart was pulling up beside the mast that flew the aid station's black flag. The first wounded were being brought in. We promised we would wait here, but that doesn't mean we cannot lend a hand. She smoothed down her skirt. It would be good to help with the wounded. It would take her mind off worrying about Billy. Come on, Mr. Ballard. Let's see what we can do here. Billy hated thunderstorms. No one knew it, not his mother, and most certainly not Abigail, the girl who used to come to the gin palace every night to ply her trade. It was probably the only thing about him that Abigail did not know. He smiled as he remembered the nights spent sitting with her as she waited for custom. He had told her everything, and in return she had held his hand, and on a few very rare occasions let him lay his head in her lap. Now he sat on the ground, listening to the dreadful cacophony of battle, wondering how he could ever have been frightened of something as gentle as thunder. Each blast of cannon fire sent a shudder running through his body. It reverberated through him, every bone jangling with each concussion. The fear was like a creature that lived deep in his guts. It fought like it was cornered, tearing at his bravery so that it ran into his bowels, churning and twisting as it fought to escape. To ward off the fear, Billy tried to conjure an image of Abigail. He thought of how she smelled, how she giggled at his attempts to make her laugh. He needed her then, more than he could ever have imagined needing anyone. Yet she refused to come, his mind failing to picture the girl he dreamed of every night. The noise of battle grew louder. It was coming closer. For the first time he heard the screams, the dreadful banshee wails of men meeting death. His fear built. He wanted to run, to flee from the copse of trees where he had been left. He looked back at the 3 horses. They were as frightened as he was. They stood with ears alert and twitching. Every so often they tossed their heads or pulled against their tethers, hooves pawing nervously at the soil. The animals shared his desire to run, their own instincts urging them to flee. Yet they were tethered firmly, Palmer's knots holding them fast. Billy was tied to the spot just as securely. He would not give in. He would not run. He would not let Jack down. There had been few men in Billy's life. He had no idea who his father might be. He was well aware of what his mother had done before he had come along, and he knew better than to ask about the man who had sired him. His life had been run by women, both his mother and Maggie Lampkin taking care of him as best they could. His friends had been whores like Abigail, the young girls who paid Maggie a shilling to work the Gin Palace's meagre crowd. The only men he knew had been punters, the customers of either the palace or the girls. None had paid much attention to the skinny boy gathering dirty glasses, or snapping off a measure or two if his mother and Maggie were especially busy. Then Jack had come along. Billy did not think he had ever known someone like Jack. He had met strong men before, men with big arms and wide shoulders who would start a fight as quickly as they would order a pennyworth of gin. None had carried themselves as Jack did, his quiet confidence so different to the bawdy gobshites Billy was used to. He had seen the way other men looked at Jack, the sly, furtive appraisals as they compared themselves and were invariably found lacking. He had also spotted the way women stared at him, with hooded eyes, their lust as easy to read as a man's fear. Billy wanted to be just like Jack. He stayed sitting on the ground, controlling the shakes and the shudders as best he could. He would not run, not for anything.